efforts to support Dr. Karen Orvis, the Chief Statistician of the United States, as her office is expected to announce any revisions to federal race and ethnicity standards by the summer of 2024. The continued dedication and efforts of the incredible team at the Census Bureau has resulted in over a decade of research to improve the measurement of race and ethnicity for communities across our country. And none of the research conducted would have been possible without our incredibly passionate staff. Since 2007, the Census Bureau team has developed and conducted qualitative and quantitative tests, including 3 large-scale, nationally representative tests on improving race and ethnicity measures. The 2010 Census Race and Ethnicity Origin Alternative Questionnaire Experiment, the 2015 National Content Test, and the 2016 American Community Survey Content Test. The results of these research projects have underscored the need for improved race and ethnicity measures and have been central to the development of the OMB Working Group's proposals for revising federal race and ethnicity standards. At the Census Bureau, we understand the importance of accurate race and ethnicity measurement in addressing inequality. The Population Division works in great partnership with the Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics Division and the Center for Economic Studies to develop myriad critical statistics and research that address racial and ethnic inequality across various outcome measures ranging from health to wealth. And we will be hearing more on the importance of accurate race and ethnicity measures in inequality research in many of the workshop sessions over the next 2 days. It is the Census Bureau's unwavering dedication to the advancement of research on race, ethnicity, and equity that has led to the formation of a cross-directorate initiative, the Data Dissemination Research and Applications Initiative for improving underlying race and ethnicity data. With members from the Center for Economic Studies, the Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics Division, and the Population Division, this interdisciplinary team of social scientists is working together to improve underlying race and ethnicity data and to improve Census Bureau research on racial and ethnic inequalities. A critical component of this initiative is the convening of this virtual workshop. Our goal for this virtual workshop is to bring together new perspectives on how data resources can be better leveraged to both measure the dimensions of race and ethnicity within the United States population and to investigate how systemic inequalities by race and ethnicity can be seen within U.S. society. We believe that with the help of all of the researchers that have volunteered to share their work, we will accomplish just that. Over the next 2 days, we have the pleasure of hearing from researchers from across a broad range of disciplines, from government, academia, and independent research centers. The various sessions have been organized by topic, with research examining racial and ethnic inequalities in health, employment, education, and housing, as well as issues related to theory on racial and ethnic identities, and measurement of race, ethnicity, and different dimensions of social and economic experiences and inequalities. Today, we have the honor of hearing from our Census Bureau Director, Robert Santos, as well as a keynote address from Meeta Anand, the Senior Program Director for Census and Data Equity at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. Both Director Santos and Ms. Anand share our team's passion and recognition of the importance of accurate measures of race and ethnicity in addressing inequality. And I'm excited to hear more from all of our speakers throughout the next couple of days. We are so grateful for all our workshop participants, including the session chairs, discussants, and presenters as well as the team working behind the scenes, making this workshop possible. We are excited to have so many participants and members of the audience that share the Census Bureau's passion and commitment to advance research on race, ethnicity, and equity here with us today. So thank you again to all of you in the audience for taking the time to be here, and we hope to see you all back tomorrow for day 2 of the workshop. And with that, I thank you all again, and I will pass the mic over to Director Santos. Thank you.
And Karen, before we begin, I'm just going to go over with Director Santos's remarks. I'm going to go over a little bit of our agenda for today. So thank you again for your great remarks to open the workshop. For those of you who are attending, we have about 300 people in the audience so far. Again, a reminder that these sessions are being recorded, and so you can feel free to come back and watch the videos on our website after the workshop. We encourage you to stay with us as long as possible during the 2-day workshop. So this morning, we're going to have a session that begins at 9:45, exploring racial and ethnic inequalities in health. We're having presentations from a number of different researchers and agencies, universities, and other institutions across the United States. We'll have another session beginning at 11:25 that's on theorizing racial and ethnic identities and measurement. Then we'll break for lunch. We have a lunch break from 12:25 1 o'clock p.m. And we'll continue in the afternoon with a session on the effects of measurement of race and ethnicity on measures of racial and ethnic inequality. Later in the afternoon, we'll follow that with session 4. Session 4 is going to discuss the relationship of place to racial and ethnic inequalities, as well as place-based inequality measures. We'll have another session then wrapping up the day with closing remarks, and we'll go into our next sessions tomorrow with another full day with our workshop. So again, I wanted to remind everyone that you can tune in throughout the day or come back and check in with us. Feel free to come and go as you please. I wanted to do a quick check with our organizers to see if we have Director Santos on the line. I know that we're waiting until about 8:45 a.m. for him to start. Sam, Anthony, it looks like we do not have the director yet, so I have a couple other remarks that I can share. I wanted to mention again that this event is being recorded, and we have information available for all of you to provide questions in the chat, to leave those questions for us so that the chairs can help to share your questions with the discussants and the presenters during the Q&A period. I'll say a little bit more about how this research began. We really were very pleased with the call for interest in this workshop. We had about 75 different submissions, and we're very, very excited about the quality of the submissions that we received. So much so that we're hoping to do this workshop again. So you're joining us for the initial run of our workshop, and we're very excited about all the perspectives that are being brought to share with us today. Again, this event is bringing together new perspectives on how data resources that the Census Bureau has can be better leveraged to help measure both the dimensions of race and ethnicity within the US population, and also help us to think about and investigate how systematic inequalities by race and ethnicity can be better identified within our society. So again, we thank you all for joining us today, and we would encourage you to share your questions. I see that we had a question about adding the written agenda and the times of the session. So I'll turn to one of my colleagues to see if it's possible for that to be shared with the link to the Census Bureau website where we have the full agenda posted. And if we could put that into the chat for everyone, you'll be able to follow along and see where we are throughout the day. We'll also have a full day of presentations tomorrow, where we have another series of sessions focused on various aspects of measuring race and ethnicity and inequality. Tomorrow's sessions will begin, again, you can log in between 8:45 and 9 a.m. for day 2 of the workshop. We'll begin at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning with welcoming remarks from David Waddington, who is the Census Bureau's Division Chief for Social, Economic, and Housing Statistics. And then we have a series of sessions focusing on various measures of race and ethnicity and inequality. So it's now 8:45 a.m. and I am just checking to see if we have been able to bring in Director Santos at this point.
We did not see him on WebEx as of yet.
Okay. Thank you for confirming. So I'm going to go over briefly the remarks or the sessions that we have planned for day 2 of the event. Again, this is posted on the Census Bureau's website for the workshop, where you can find the full slate of our agenda. And we will also be sharing video with all of you so you can watch the various sessions and share them with colleagues. Tomorrow morning, we'll have a session on racial and ethnic inequality in employment and the labor market. We'll follow up with session 2, which is exploring measures of within group diversity of experience. And then we'll have a short break. Session 3 tomorrow will focus on racial and ethnic inequality in educational experiences and outcomes. And then we will have a break for lunch tomorrow, a little later than we do today, but we'll have lunch tomorrow from 1:15 to 1:45. Session 4 on day 2 will focus on racial and ethnic inequalities in home ownership. And we'll finish up with a session 5 focusing on measuring and conceptualizing segregation in schools, in neighborhoods, and the labor market. So again, we have a very full slate of presentations, discussant remarks, and Q&A with all of our presenters throughout the next 2 days. So again, we thank you for joining us, and we're very excited about this dialogue that we have with all of you over the next 48 hours. Okay, it looks like we've put a link to the workshop in the chat. And so you can go to the Census Bureau website to find the final program, as well as information about the workshop. All of that is available. There's a direct link to the PDF. Thank you for sharing that. And we wanted to provide that information for all of our attendees to also share with others and encourage them to join us. Okay. Again, encouraging everyone, as you have questions throughout the day during our sessions, please share those with us, and that will help us to go through the Q&A period for each of the sessions with the discussants and the chairs. And I will do a quick check with our organizers just to see if we wanted to go forward and perhaps switch up the keynote remarks with Director Santos and with Ms. Anand, if we do not have Director Santos on at this moment.
Hello, Nicholas. This is Karen. I suggest we ask Mita Anand to give her remarks. Thanks.
Thank you, Karen. So Mita, I see that you're on with us. Would it be okay if we switched gears and had you give the remarks that you have prepared today?
Aaron, my remarks are ready to go.
Thank you so much, Mita. We're really happy that you can be here with us today, and thank you for coming to help us kick off this great workshop. So with no further ado, Mita, I'll turn things over to you, and please, take all the time that you had prepared. We're really looking forward to what you have to share with us today.
Oh, Absolutely. And I didn't get on in time for the video and sound check. I'm assuming that's okay. Everything's cool.
Yes, can hear you
Great.
loud and clear and see you. You're coming through, and we see you live and in
Great.
person.
Wonderful. Well, firstly, thank you to Karen, to Nicholas, to Director Santos, to the Census Bureau for this incredible honor and opportunity to speak with all of you. And thank you to all of you for caring so deeply about this important issue. I've been asked to talk about why this subject matter means so much to me and why it should mean so much to all of us. And I want to offer that there are three different ways to think about data collection and granular data collection or data collection by race and ethnicity. One is the tension between the individual and the greater. One is the stories it tells us. And one is what stories do we tell about it? So let's go to the first one, the tension between the individual and the greater. And in order to discuss that, I want to tell you a little bit about myself. So I graduated from college with a degree, a bachelor's degree in political science and economics. I was determined to become an economist, and I'm still jealous of all of you that are economists. I started my career as a research assistant in economics at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston. After 2 years, I left and I got a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. From there, I ended up working at a bank, Banco Santander, where I did credit analysis in corporate banking. And throughout all of this, I was really seeking and searching for ways to think of how to include others, how to diversify who we were thinking about and who we were serving. And I wasn't really quite getting there. So from there, I did what any reasonable person would do, and I left and I went to law school. After law school, I worked at the Court of International Trade, which is in New York City. And from there, I ended up working as a finance associate at a major law firm, White & Case. And you would say, well, Mita, that doesn't really fit into the story you're telling. Well, it did, because it was the project and asset finance group. And that group was really, really interested in international development and really looking at building out projects that were helping out more vulnerable communities. After I did that, I worked in the business development unit of White & Case before leaving and trying to change my path to really get to more fundamentally understanding how we can serve underserved communities and how we can really ensure that we are capturing them in our work in all aspects of society. And the reason I told this story, and I'll get to how I ended up talking to you today in a minute, but I'm giving you that background for a reason. All of these areas are really, really focused, I think, on that tension. Because if you think about economics and law, and I will contend till the day I die that they're incredibly similar, what we have in both of them is like we're looking at rules to apply to situations and how people are seeking to fit themselves into categories or exclude themselves from categories. So it's constantly a question of who is our universe? What is our data set? How are we thinking about what is and is not included? How are we seeking to include what is not included? How are people saying, I fit in here, but not here? And how are we treating outliers in these situations? It is all of these, and I would argue finance is the same way. When I was a banker, right? Like albeit it's slightly different, right? But it's companies seeking to get that better rate, that better interest rate because they fit into a certain category, or to get themselves out of a certain category. So really what we have in these disciplines is a search for, or at least in my instance, I can't speak for everyone, a search for including and ensuring that we're hearing the voices of and accounting for and bringing in the most vulnerable into what is considered the mainstream. So really those that are not mainstream into the mainstream. Um, Before I continue, I'll just conclude the story of how I ended up here before you. I had the wonderful opportunity of getting a chance to work with New York Immigration Coalition and specifically to head up New York Counts 2020, which was the CBO effort for a fair and accurate census in New York for the 2020 census. And that when I did that work, which I got due to the background in law and business development, which, believe it or not, has a lot to do with coalition building, I discovered that it really, really spoke to me, that what I was seeking for all this time in being able to get to something structural and fundamental, and that would allow people to really understand what was going on. When I got to the census work, it just spoke to me in a way that no other work I had ever had spoke to me before. And it spoke to all areas that we have in our lives, be it the finance sector, the government sector, law, economics, private sector, nonprofit. So I suddenly was like, this is that work I had been looking for all along. So I just really threw myself into it. And thanks to that opportunity and the opportunity afforded to me by the leadership conference, and afforded to me by a lot of you that I know I'm speaking to today, I've had this opportunity to really grow and think and really have that desire to ensure that our society shows up in its data sets in a way that they wish to show up. So that is really my first thread there, was the tension between the individual and the greater. And I'm sure you can see how that applies in how we all think about the work, because a lot of us really care about data disaggregation, and there's always that search. How granular do we go with the data, while we're still trying to have actionable and meaningful data that we can actually work with, and that can tell us a story, which brings me to my second thread. What stories do the data tell us? So, I mean, this is no surprise to anyone listening, but the census, decennial census, the American Community Survey, and all the other surveys by the Census Bureau really give us a portrait of who we are. And it allows us to tell the story of who we are as a nation, or as individual communities, or within certain geographies. As the as I was preparing for this event, I took the opportunity to ask some of my colleagues about ways in which they see data mattering to them. And I did this because it's all very well and good to sit around on the census and data equity team and high five each other all day about how important we think data are. But ultimately, we are all doing this work in the service of ensuring that other people are able to do the work they need to do. So one of my colleagues pointed out, and this goes straight into what I think will be the first session today, that data disaggregation by race and ethnicity, and of course, multiple other demographic variables, is so important for preventing discrimination in healthcare settings and understanding and addressing disparities in healthcare access and outcomes. And that we recently called for HHS, Health and Human Services, to require demographic data collection based on multiple demographic variables in our comments to the Section 1557 proposed rule. We also know that census poverty data released after the American Rescue Plan Act expansion of the child care tax credit showed the incredible impact that the CTC had on the historic narrowing of racial and ethnic differences in child poverty for Black and Latino children. We also know that we had the Alabama redistricting case earlier this year, where the Supreme Court called for the creation of a second Black majority district. And I think every one of us knows that that work simply would not be possible without having the underlying data to show it. And I wouldn't be me if I didn't pause here to say, we know, based on the Census Bureau's own data, so I'm not saying anything too out of school, that we do have an undercount of the Black population in the United States, and it's been a persistent undercount since the beginning of our nation. And so can you imagine that, like, even with this undercount of Black Americans, and we can presume it is also in Alabama, even though we don't have it on a state-by-state basis. I wouldn't be an advocate if I didn't slip that in there. We can only imagine if we had even better data and more accurate data and more complete data based on race and ethnicity, what other outcomes we'd be able to achieve. One of my colleagues who works on the Fair Courts team didn't even bother giving me multiple examples because she said, we know that courts regularly rely on data that are presented to them in order to make determinations. So we use data in order to be able to speak truth to power, in order to be able to define who we are. We have started a blog series at the Leadership Conference that talks about all the ways data impacts and are affected by different groups. And I would encourage you to take a visit over to the website, but included within that, we talk about data and Native American groups, data and LGBTQI plus groups, data and disability groups, because every single one of these groups, and we have over 13 blogs, so I'm not going to name every single one, but when we look at it that way, it really evidences to us how it is just so crucial and critical to our work that we do have that complete and accurate data that allows every person and every community to be represented in the data set. And hence, that's why we have these highly important debates of what categories we should have when we're looking at race and ethnicity data collection. Earlier this year, we had OMB's initial proposed revisions to the race and ethnicity standards, everyone's favorite statistical policy directive number 15. And there was such engagement in that. And Afro-Latino groups did not feel comfortable with a combined question, feeling that it would not allow that community to be counted as fully or as accurately as possible. Middle Eastern and North African groups were really advocating for this because they are currently invisible in the data sets. And just the fact, to me, that just speaks to the power of the data, that you had groups coming in and fighting over, maybe fighting's too big a word, but really, really engaging with this because they knew how deeply important it was to be able to show up in the data and show up as they wanted to show up. And we see countless examples of how much it means to groups to have this. I remember in New York, in the 2020 census, there was much rejoicing when the Sikh community found out that there'd be a code for Sikhs so that they could then show up in the DDHC and they would be able to be represented within the decennial census. Many of us might have been paying attention to the Hmong population who want to be classified as Southeast Asian right now versus as East Asian. I'm not saying this to like bring up all the controversies. I'm saying it to show that people care that much. They care so much that they want to show up in the data set and show up as who they believe themselves to be. And this is why here at the Leadership Conference, we do have an entire program dedicated to doing data disaggregation work and looking and advocating for increased data disaggregation, both at the OMB race and ethnicity standards level and data collected at state agencies. And that's what's really interesting about all of this, and why I'm putting this under the category about what stories it tells us, because if you look at a state by state by state comparison of what level of data are required to be collected, there's an increased movement to seeing data disaggregation across the states, not every state, but we're increasingly seeing states adopt the requirements for increased data disaggregation at a race and ethnicity level. There is no consistency. It is really varying state by state. Some states have up to 75 categories, like Washington State. And other states might just have 3. But why do I bring this up? Well, when you look at the categories that states pick to include in their data disaggregation, it starts telling you a bit about how those states see themselves and how the communities in those states see themselves. And what it also shows us is that it's really, really hard. Like, no one box or series of boxes can ever fully capture the complexities of who we are. But what we keep doing is trying to get closer and trying to get to that answer of who we are. And of course, I hope many of you read the New York Times piece that came out earlier this year, last month in October, that really showed the evolution of the race question on the Census Bureau forms, which I found to be utterly fascinating, and I think really shows that it tells us a story, but at the same time, wait for it, going to the third thread, it tells us what stories we're telling about it as well. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you have not read Dan Bouck's book, Democracy's Data, I commend it to you. Buy it today, borrow it from the library today. It's incredible. It was named a New York Times most notable, top 100 notable books of 2022, and there's a reason they named it that. And this book gives a compelling portrait of how data are constructed. And one of the main lessons we get from the book is what we learn depends on what questions we ask. And you can see how the questions evolve and change from decade to decade based on what was preoccupying the nation at that moment, where the nation's own interests and necessities were leading to. So, you start seeing in the 20s and 30s, like, should we be asking an income question? You see the shift, as I referenced before when talking about the New York Times article, the shift from decade to decade about how we ask the race question. If you think about it, there's that shift about how we think of a household and who the head of household is. So it's not just the data are telling us stories, we're telling stories about it because we're seeing a whole other sort of meta story on top of it that's telling us how our nation is viewing itself through how it is collecting the data. On top of that, data don't exist in a vacuum. So we can tell stories, and we will, thanks to what I know will be incredible research presented over the next 2 days. We can tell stories of poorer outcomes. And unfortunately, there are many stories of poorer outcomes. And it is also just as easy to pervert the stories of poorer outcomes and conclude that poorer outcomes are the fault of an individual or a group. But we don't do that, or at least I hope we don't. And we don't do that because we then look to the data around it, other data points, other data such as access to services, income, quality of services, education, and we start to get a different picture. We're able to paint a different picture because we're not just looking at one point of data, we are looking at the entire context and the portrait that it is painting. What we also know when we're talking about data and the stories we tell about it is that language matters. I have to admit, I've not yet read Deb Stemkowski's piece on how to count versus historically undercounted. So my apologies, though I do promise you it's on my list. But that just speaks to this struggle we have over the language around data. Do we call groups hard to count? Advocates have often said no, because that places the blame on those communities that are not counted. And yet many of us know, referring back to my point that it's the greater contextual story, many of us know that hard to count and people who are not counted, there are historic reasons why they do not wish to engage with the system. They point to, stories of mistrust and stories of misuse of data that lead them to wish to be outside the system and not engage with it. We also use hard to reach, referring to like last mile issues, like whether it's the internet or a language access issue or an illiteracy issue. We have switched to using historically undercounted. Yet that isn't even painting a full picture, because groups that were historically undercounted, well, we might have new groups that are newly undercounted. Lately, I have taken to calling it persistently undercounted to really capture the fact that it isn't something that is just in the past, but also something that we keep seeing occur again and again due to some sort of systemic nature of the problem. But I use this as an example because we all use these terms and we're all using them to mean very specific things. And again, it's like telling a story about a data set and about the data. It's the story we're telling about it, not that the story it's telling to us. Another way I want to put this and think about this is flipping how we think about the census. As someone who came into data work due to my now deep and unabiding love for the census, we work very hard in the census advocate stakeholder communities to advocate for a complete, a fair, and accurate census. That to count everyone means to count everyone, and we want everyone counted. And so we look at those groups that are undercounted, and you can use whatever of the terms I enumerated above. And we think about like, how can we get them counted? And what I would like to offer is what we get from that portrait of the decennial census is not so much how do we get them counted, but it gives us a snapshot of who is marginalized and most vulnerable in our society. The reasons we can't count them is because they don't have access to broadband, because they do not believe or trust in the government, because they feel abandoned and left behind, because their interactions with the government have left them feeling worse off instead of better off. So it can be a diagnostic tool in figuring out what we need to fix in our society, instead of just the tool for getting representation and money into our society. So how do we pull these three strands together? Well, categories on government forms do not define communities. People do. And while the categories don't define us, we use them as an opportunity to allow us to work towards providing equal opportunity to all, to helping to remediate and alleviate differential outcomes. When we have information that accurately, or more realistically, more accurately reflects who we are, we can then better advocate for the future we all deserve. And what does this all mean? It means that our showing up as advocates, researchers, Census Bureau employees, everyday person on the street, government officials, local, state, federal, showing up allows us to tell our stories rather than risk others telling the stories for us. And where does this leave us? Ultimately, it means that communities matter. We need to center our work in communities, by communities, and for communities so that they are engaged in figuring out what stories we really want to be told, what stories we want to hear, and what context we want to put them in. So I hope these reflections, speak to you. I suspect they do. I suspect it underlies so much of the great work we'll be learning about over the next couple of days. And I really, really want to thank, again, the Census Bureau and all of you for affording me the opportunity to share these thoughts with you today.
Mita, thank you so much for being here with us this morning and for sharing your remarks and your perspective and your experience. This is just a great foundational start for our workshop today, so we really appreciate you being here. I'll ask if you could hold on with us, and please feel free to go off camera. We're going to invite next Director Robert Santos to join us today, and we're very pleased that the director can be here with us this morning. I have a couple opening remarks to introduce Director Santos, and then we'll turn the floor over to him. So Robert L. Santos is the 26th Director of the U.S. Census Bureau. His career spans more than 40 years in survey research, statistical design and analysis, and executive level management. Before coming to the Census Bureau, he spent 15 years as Vice President and Chief Methodologist at the Urban Institute and directed its Statistical Methods Group. He also served as Executive Vice President and partner of NewStats, a social science research firm in Austin, Texas. Director Santos specializes in quantitative and qualitative research design, including program evaluation, needs assessments, survey methodology, and survey operations. He also has expertise in demographic and administrative data, decennial censuses, social policy research, and equity issues in research. So he's very well situated to be an important messenger for our work with this workshop and with the initiative. We're very happy to have him with us this morning to share his thoughts with all of us about the Census Bureau's virtual workshop, Advancing Research on Race, Ethnicity, and Inequality. So Director Santos, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us this morning. Turn the floor.
Good morning, Nicholas, and I hope you guys can hear me. If you can't, I assume that somebody will say something.
We're good to go. Thank you.
Okay. And it was a wonderful talk, Mita, and I very much appreciate all you had to say. It very much resonated with me, who I am now as the head of the Census Bureau, but it also resonates in terms of where I came from in the policy research world. So thank you for your really provocative, wonderful remarks. And good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining our workshop. You know, research on race, ethnicity, and inequality is incredibly important, especially at this point in our history. Why? Because our nation's becoming increasingly and beautifully more diverse. Hey, 7 states, including the 2 most populous, California and Texas, can now boast that a majority of their population is represented by people of color. And the number of states is only going to go up. It's going to rise with time. It's who we are. You know, I've always seen the diversity of our country as a great asset. Our insights, our knowledge base, and indeed our lives are enriched when people from different cultures, life experiences, and languages share their diverse perspectives with us. Yet, racial and ethnic disparities and inequities have been documented, and they persist to this day. We'll learn more about that over the next 2 days, thanks to the researchers who will be presenting at the workshop. Now, a critical step in addressing any problem is that of isolating and documenting it, of understanding its depth and its breadth. And of course, the best way to do that is with data. That's why I'm so proud that the US Census Bureau provides statistical data that can be used to understand who we are, including our blossoms and our blemishes. We need to know the straight facts. That's partly why we're here today, to meet and discuss research on race and ethnicity. We'll see new perspectives on how data resources can help us better understand the dimensions of race and ethnicity in America. And we'll see research that explores systemic inequalities by race and ethnicity within our society. The ability to provide statistical data to improve society is essential in our mission at the Census Bureau. We provide quality data about the nation's people and economy. We produce data that reflects an accurate portrait of America, and that includes data about race and ethnicity. And it includes the ability to use those data to reveal inequalities and inequities. During my almost 2 years now as director of the Census Bureau, I've launched an extensive external engagement effort across the nation. I've spoken to pastors, mayors, elected officials. I've spoken to chambers of commerce, businesses, scientific communities, associations, to college students, tribes, community groups, nonprofits. That's just to mention a few. And I've greatly appreciated and valued their willingness to engage in a two-way conversation, a flow of ideas, suggestions, and concerns. You know, a key recurring message was the need for more relevant data that better captures communities and tribes' local experiences. Data that better reflects the rich diversity of communities and neighbors. This included the value of disaggregated data, especially by race and ethnicity, especially at low levels of geography. Combining race ethnicity data with our rich socioeconomic data creates great potential for understanding economic development possibilities, addressing community needs, and mitigating inequities in areas like housing and voting and language, employment, education, public health, and so forth. We're working to develop new ways to collect data that are more accurate, timely, relevant, and most of all, meet the needs of the public. We're continuously assessing the improvement of our statistical programs from the perspective of the underserved groups. For example, we're working closely with the Chief Statistician of the US and the Office of Management and Budget in the review of the Statistical Policy Directive 15. That directive governs how federal data collectors or how federal data collects and reports race and ethnicity data. We're also continuously researching strategies to improve respondent cognition of survey questions for diverse populations. I've mentioned earlier that our country is becoming increasingly and more beautifully diverse. So I'd like to leave you with a story about an experience that I had that's so simple, and yet it had a great impact on who I am as a leader and how I value data for equity. And it fits with the purpose of this particular workshop. It's a story that comes from the late 1990s when I was a study section member for a federal grant-making agency. Okay, I'll say it, Agency for Health Quality Research. And as part of that work, I'd receive a newsletter that would talk about recent and ongoing research. So one day I was like perusing that particular newsletter, and I came upon the results of a grant that looked at the impact of a comparative study of Spanish-speaking patients who sought healthcare at clinics. And it's the results that drew my attention. So the research found that when Spanish-speaking patients presented at a clinic where some of the healthcare staff had even a little proficiency in Spanish, then the patient outcomes were more favorable than situations where healthcare staff didn't speak any Spanish. Now, my first reaction, I confess, was to break out laughing. Do we really need to do research to verify that people who understand healthcare instructions have better outcomes than those who don't? But then I had an epiphany, and it hit me like a bolt of lightning. I realized that this was the first time ever that I'd seen a research project that showed how an industry, in this case, the healthcare industry, was acculturating to an increasingly diverse population. Instead of insisting that people who seek healthcare learn English or face the consequences, the institution itself was recognizing its obligation to adapt culturally to its customer base, its evolving customer base. And whether fully aware or implicit, the federal grant-making agency was acting on that obligation through that grant. No more English only. That was a big deal. You know, that lesson still applies today, especially now as we're becoming increasingly diverse. If we're to fulfill our mission to provide quality data on our nation's population and economy, the US Census Bureau, and indeed all federal statistical agencies, need to start adapting, or not start, but need to continue adapting to be acculturating to our increasingly diverse society. That means providing more relevant data, be it disaggregated racial ethnic data or data that capture the full spectrum of other aspects of our diversity, age, sex, gender, geography, and so forth. We need to offer new and expanded data platforms that better serve our diverse constituencies, not all of whom happen to be data nerds. And that includes, in the bigger picture, researchers, policymakers, governments, tribal nations, inner city and rural communities, and businesses, just to name a few. That's why it's so important to actively seek and value diverse perspectives from the public. We need to better understand how to acculturate. In a sense, this story brings us back to the purpose of this workshop, to present research on race and ethnicity and inequality. And the way I see it, population disparities and inequities represent the outcome of interactions between the people and our institutions. Think about that. Both need attention, and data from the US Census Bureau can help make that happen. So thank you for being here today and for engaging with us and sharing your research. Thank you again, Mira, and I'll pass it back to Nicholas.
Thank you so much, Director Santos. We really appreciate your remarks today. We deeply value your perspective, your presence, and especially your personal story. Thank you for your remarks and also for the remarks from Mita and from Karen this morning. They provide such an important foundation for this workshop and really help us to kick off the 2 days in great fashion. So I want to thank all three of you for participating in the workshop and sharing your perspectives and your experiences. Hopefully our audience members have seen in the chat that we are looking for questions from you. We'd like to share your questions with the director, and we have time for a few questions before we get into our first session. So I'll start with a question that was posed and ask Mita if you could share your perspective on this. So we know that the workshop is really focused on a lot of different research that's being explored by various researchers, academics, federal agency work, independent research work across the country and across a wide variety of topics for improving the measurement of race and ethnicity, and also the ways in which we can improve our understanding and our measurement of inequalities on various different aspects. So one of the questions would just be if you could talk about your perspective on what kind of academic research you would like to see from the perspective of your work and your experience, particularly with social policy.
Wow, just going for like, give it everything to us. I mean, honestly, at this stage, what I would love to understand is really the interplay of broadband, education, employment, and race and ethnicity. Because as we are moving into an increasingly online world where we start seeing marginalization and increasing vulnerability, is through that area where people are being left out. Right? We are seeing increasing access to employment being conducted through broadband and internet. We see increasing engagement with democracy happening through broadband and internet and education. So I think we really need to look at what is going on there, who is accessing it, at what cost, and how much the inability to access it leaves people in a spiral of being left behind.
Thank you, Mita. Our next question I'll pose to both Director Santos and to Mita. Maybe first we'll start with Director Santos. Based on your framing and your understanding for today's workshop, we really understand how important this message is, this topic is. What would you hope that attendees can take away from their participation in the workshop today and tomorrow?
So what I'll say, I would like to see, and my hopes and dreams are the realization that different ways of looking at data, be it race, ethnicity, or be it the social issues that that are being examined in public health and employment and families and children and such, that those different perspectives are recognized as really bringing value and insight to our knowledge base about how to improve society. So it's more, I have a more generic perspective on this because I'm so driven to make sure that we get perspectives that aren't simply the same old, here's the classic research approach. When I go off to universities, I often advise the students because I every time I go off site and I'm doing my external engagement, I try to get in an HBCU or a community college or even an R1 institution, and I say, look, you need to bring your whole self, your culture, your values, your life experiences to the table as a researcher, because that provides you the unique perspective that nobody else has, because it's your own, it's based on you. And so when you're being taught, you shouldn't think of like, what would my professor think my approach should be on this? You need to be thinking about your own perspective. And that's what I'm hoping here, that people have brought their own perspectives, their unique perspectives based on their own life experiences and culture, to reveal the true value of census data, because there's not always one, there is never only one way to interpret the data. There's always different ways. And by allowing folks with different perspectives to bring that forward, we can realize the value of diverse perspectives.
Thank you, Director. So well said. And again, thank Mita, and I thank Karen for sharing your personal perspectives with data and with census to really help frame this conversation. Mita, I'll pose the same question to you. What would you like attendees to take away from their experience with the workshop?
Well, Nicholas, it's not very fair of you to ask me to go after the director when he answered so well. So, but I will say two things. One is, I want people to walk away with the understanding of the importance of engagement with data and to bring it back to their communities. to have communities learn how to engage with the data. So, really think about how we're not just extracting data from communities, but how it's being done in service of our communities and how this research can be deployed to that effect. And then secondly, I would say something similar to what the director said, which is pause and take a step back and think about like, what else is the data telling us right here? Like, what are we not seeing? What question have we not asked? Is there an alternative story that is being told here that we need to explore further? I do think we do need to bring our own lived experiences to the work, but part of bringing those lived experiences to the work is remembering that we each have a different lived experience, and stepping back and thinking like, how will this be perceived, or how would someone else interact with these data, or how would someone else tell this story with the same set of data or facts in front of them, because that might illuminate even more areas for remediation of inequities or for further research.
Thank you, Mita. So somehow you were reading into one of our other questions that we've received. So I really appreciate your remarks with that. I'm going to turn to you again and just ask if you could expand on that a little bit more. How can people who care about these issues engage with data collection, data research, advocacy? How can they engage with federal agencies or within their own communities and contexts? How can they better engage with the data to help inform these discussions and policy decisions?
Well, the ways are, multifold. So firstly, there are always Federal Register notices coming out that the OMB is putting out, discussing, sometimes by the Census Bureau, sometimes by the OMB, sometimes by other agencies, about changes to how they wish to collect data. And right there, that is an opportunity to engage with the collection of data. Right now, I'm sure I'm not going to remember every single FRN that the Census Bureau has out, but right now there's one on changes to disability questions on the American Community Survey. You don't have to be Mita Anand or any of the researchers presenting here today to respond to that. You can respond as a person who cares about this and has a view. So that's one way. Another way is at your local community level. If you identify an issue that concerns you, you can actually, well, firstly, you can look for data on data.gov, and no, listeners, no one at the Census Bureau asked me to say that, but like you can start looking for data at data.gov to try to understand what's going on in your community. But you can also start working with a community-based organization in your community that's focused on an issue that you are focused on, and you can see whether or not data are available to help you understand that issue. If not, right there, there's an opportunity. So I'll give an example. In New York right now, New York State has passed a very strong data disaggregation law for AA and HPI communities for collection of healthcare data. This was actually done as part of an advocacy campaign by groups on the ground here in New York. So this is a group that understood that in order for their communities to be more properly served, they needed data on their communities that they weren't getting because the category of Asian was too broad for them to actually understand the individual needs of the individual communities. One of the blogs we have up on our website about healthcare data and data disaggregation even tells the story of how in California, once they got disaggregated data on Asian communities, they were seeing differing COVID outcomes and could start tailoring their work based on communities. So I say that to say, like, just even engaging with your local organization over something that matters to you, you can help galvanize efforts to start getting the data you need. And as you start getting data you need and start being able to work for better outcomes, I view it as a virtuous cycle. Like, to me, engaging in getting data we need, that's democracy. That's not, that's not just like some wonky data thing. Like, that's democracy at its very fundamental aspect. It's not democracy just because it leads to electoral college votes or reapportionment of seats. It's democracy because it allows us to look at who we are and make decisions based upon it.
Thank you so much, Mita, for your remarks and your perspective. Director Santos, we have a question for you. A couple of people are familiar with the work that's being done at the Census Bureau to connect with Bowie State University, the University of Texas San Antonio, for example. What are some of the ways that you see those engagements really helping us to address and think perhaps more deeply or broadly about issues regarding the measurement of race and ethnicity and how we can better inform our understanding of inequality?
Well, thank you for that. In terms of creating partnerships, Bowie State and University of Texas in San Antonio represent two of a lot more. We're actively working throughout the country to see how we can engage with HBCUs, with other minority serving institutions, with R1s, with tribal colleges, and so forth. So we're thinking big. I think we have to think big because, in general, this applies to 2030 and pretty much everything we do at the Census Bureau. Simply trying harder is not enough. We need to rethink what we're doing. And in that context, specifically the partnerships we have with Bowie and UTSA, and more broadly, the partnership program that we're developing, we're looking for a true two-way I smile when I say this, true two-way partnership. Yes, we have amazing subject matter experts. Yes, they can help with curriculum development, and we can, work with students and faculty and such. But there's something bigger going on. We want to also learn from the communities. So Bowie State and UTSA, they have professors that are doing research. Many of them are doing community-based research and even community-based participatory research. We want to make sure that our subject matter experts are in communication and work with them to help them, advise them data availability, et cetera, but also be able to maybe listen in or participate in some of the community-based sessions so that, in essence, universities act as portals to the broader community, so we can learn how data are being used for a specific community or different neighborhoods and what those data needs are. And we can bring that information back to help inform whether we're collecting the right data, whether data we think is relevant really isn't relevant, whether something that I talk about a lot, the folks we need to learn the most about, the folks that are most vulnerable, often end up being those that are measured the least accurately. And what do we need to do about that? Better questions, better methods, etc. So there's so much we can learn and gain from a true partnership where we provide expertise and data and such, but we receive and actively work with to learn from universities as portals to communities.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's really been great to have both of you provide your remarks today and your perspectives. And one of the questions that I've seen in a couple of these chat messages is looking ahead. So we know the 2030 census is not too far away. Work is already underway in preparing for the 2030 census, learning from the 2020 census, and both of you touched on this in your remarks. But what specifically would you say would be important for this theme of measuring race and ethnicity and inequality, that we really would want to think about the challenges and the opportunities that we have as we work towards 2030? Anything that you might suggest that the researchers, the audience members could take away and really think about moving towards to improve our goals for 2030? I'll leave that open for both of you.
I think Mina should answer that. I have my own, portal to the staff, and I can provide whatever wild and crazy ideas I come up with. So Mina, please.
I actually felt the director staring at me, which is very strange considering this is all virtual. So I would say, as researchers and audience members present their findings and think about the implications of their findings, or think about what they learned today, to engage with those audience and communities that they are in turn interacting with around their work, and center how census data were critically important to this understanding, and that race and ethnicity data within that collection was even more critical within that in order to understand who we are. Because I think in order to have a successful 2030 census, I think the director already alluded to this. You can't just do 2020 and rerun it. That would make no sense, right? Because there were great things about 2020 and there were undercounts in 2020, and we don't want to see that again. So what you have to do is be constantly educating communities about the importance of the decennial census data and how it is underlying critical and crucial work every day. Census is actually every day. It is not once every 10 years. And I think as we present research, as we present outcomes and solutions that grow out of the research, to make sure how the necessity of complete, accurate, comprehensive, disaggregated race and ethnicity data underlies the ability to do this work and is critical to do this work going forward, is one way of ensuring that we have that continuity of engagement.
Well, thank you so much, Mita. Thank you, Director Santos. We're really very, very, very thankful that you could both be with us this morning to help us kick off the workshop. This has been a great foundation for us to go into a number of discussions throughout the day. So we thank you both for your time and for your presence. It's now 9:46. We are right on schedule, and I'm going to turn things over to our first session and our session chair. So thank you both for joining us today. Great to see you.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you.
Same here. Bye, Mina.
Bye.
Thank you, Nicholas. I hope everyone can hear and see me okay. My name is Nicole, and I am an economist at the Census Bureau, and I'm really thrilled to be chairing a session on racial and ethnic inequality in health. I understand there's some issue with my audio. I'm very sorry about that. Let me try one thing. Sorry.
Thanks, Nicole. Take your time. We'll try to make sure that we have a good connection with you coming through. While Nicole is testing her audio, I'll just go ahead and get us started by introducing this session. So our first session from 9:45 to 11:15 a.m. is on racial and ethnic inequalities in health. Our chair is Nicole Perales from the Center for Economic Studies at the Census Bureau, and our discussant will be Dr. Kelvin Choi from the National Institutes of Health. Nicole, when you're ready, please feel free to just jump in and I will stop talking. As you can see on the screen, we have several papers as part of this session. The first session paper will include one on the effect of Medicaid expansion on the take-up of disability benefits by race and ethnicity. We have a paper on the state Medicaid expansions in 2020 and American Indian and Alaska Native health insurance access. We also have a paper titled The Gift of a Lifetime, the Hospital, Modern Medicine, and Mortality. And finally, a paper, The Differential Exposure to Discrimination Stress as a Mediator Between Racial Identity and Health Among Hispanic or Latino Individuals. So Nicole, I'll turn back to you to see if we can check your audio again. Okay, it sounds like we may still have a few issues with Nicole's audio, so we're just going to begin, and I'll turn to our first presenter, Madeline Helfner. Madeline Helfer, if you're with us today, would you please kindly begin your presentation? Thank you, Madeline.
My name is Madeline Helfer. I'm a research assistant at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and I'm very excited to present my paper co-authored with Professors Becky Sager and Jessica Van Paris, titled The Effect of Medicaid Expansion on the Take-Up of Disability Benefits by Race and Ethnicity. Next slide, please. There are two main disability benefit programs in the United States. Social or Supplemental Security Income, SSI, and Social Security Disability Insurance, SSDI. SSI is an income restricted program. Individuals looking to enroll need to meet pretty strict income and asset requirements. And it's essentially designed as an income floor for persons with disabilities. It has about 7.6 million current enrollees. But it's the smaller of the two programs relative to SSDI, which has 9.9 million enrollees. SSDI is also somewhat unique in that it doesn't have an income requirement. However, persons looking to enroll need to have worked in a job covered by Social Security for 5 of the past 10 years. It really can't be overstated how important these benefits are as part of the social safety net for persons with disabilities. One survey found that 29% of SSDI recipients and 25% of SSI recipients reported receiving 90 to 100% of their income from the cash payments from these programs. Next slide, please. However, there seems to be some evidence that some individuals are leaving money on the table, but there's incomplete take-up of these programs. Therefore, it becomes very important to try to understand what factors influence take-up of disability benefits. And many researchers have turned to Medicaid expansion to try to examine how that might influence disability program take-up. Next slide, please. There's several different ways we might think about how Medicaid expansions might influence program take-up in this context. When we look at the SSI population, it's very important to note that SSI brings with it virtually automatic Medicaid eligibility. Therefore, we might think about some persons with disabilities who are uninsured, who may turn to the SSI program as an avenue to gain health insurance coverage. So we would call this health insurance motivated disability enrollment, or HIMDA. Therefore, we might expect that with Medicaid expansion, there would be a population of potential SSI eligibles who would reduce their take-up of SSI. In the absence of Medicaid expansion, they were enrolling simply to gain access to health insurance. Now that their health insurance coverage is not directly linked to their enrollment in these programs, they no longer are motivated to enroll. When we look at the SSDI population, we see kind of a different mechanism. We might think about somebody who has a disability. It's becoming increasingly difficult for them to work. However, in the case of SSDI, there is not automatic Medicaid eligibility, but rather enrollees receive Medicare coverage only after 2 years of being enrolled in the program. Therefore, if we have an individual with a disability, they're interested in applying to SSDI, they might actually risk quite a long period of uninsurance if they leave their job to begin the determination process for SSDI. So therefore, they're experiencing a mechanism the literature calls job lock. They're locked into their job. If they leave it to try to enroll in SSDI, they carry a risk of losing their insurance, having a long spell of uninsurance, from losing their employer-sponsored health insurance or ESHI. Therefore, we would expect that with Medicaid expansion, the potential SSDI eligibles may increase their take-up of SSDI because now they have access to health insurance through another source, through Medicaid, and are able to begin the determination process. We could continue to the next slide. So we became interested in studying how Medicaid expansions may influence disability program take-up, but we also noticed that there was no literature examining whether there were any differential impacts by race and ethnicity. So we wanted to examine not only how Medicaid expansions might influence program take-up within the overall population, but how this might affect different groups differently. Next slide, please. So to do this, we used the Current Population Survey Annual Social and Economic Supplement for the years 2009 through 2020. And we restricted our sample to working age respondents with disabilities. We defined disability according to a 7-question sequence following Burkhauser. And we defined someone as an SSI or SSDI recipient if they reported receiving SSI or SSDI income in the past year. We had a final sample of 121,494 responses. Next slide. When we first look at our data set, we see some very interesting trends in the self-reported rates of disability by race and ethnicity. We found the highest rate of self-reported disability among American Indian and Alaska Native respondents. This rate was around 21%. This is followed by Black and other race respondents at 17%. We have also observed the lowest rates of self-reported disability among white, Hispanic, and Asian respondents at 13%, 9%, and 6% respectively. Next slide, please. When we look at the rates of SSI and SSDI receipts by race and ethnicity, again, we see some interesting heterogeneity. We plotted SSI receipt in the blue bars and SSDI receipt in the red bars. We observed the highest rate of SSI receipt among Black and American Indian respondents at 26% and 24% respectively. We observed the lowest rates of SSI receipt among white and Asian respondents at 15% and 13% respectively. When we turn to SSDI, we notice the highest rates of receipt among Black, white, and American Indian and Alaska Native respondents, 27%, 25%, and 22%. We also noticed that for the majority of groups, SSDI receipt tended to be higher than SSI receipt, which is of course, consistent with the fact that SSDI is a much larger program. However, we noticed that for American Indian and Alaska Native respondents, as well as Hispanic respondents, that SSI receipt was actually higher among these groups than SSDI receipt, which is particularly interesting given that SSDI payments tend to be somewhat larger than SSI payments. We could continue to the next slide. So to understand how Medicaid expansion might influence this take-up, we've decided to rely on a difference in differences approach with a heterogeneous treatment design. Essentially, this allows us to estimate differential responses to expansion by race and ethnicity. We also included a whole host of different sociodemographic and socioeconomic controls, such as race, marital status, homeownership, whether someone had a bachelor's degree, plurality, the state poverty rate, and state and year fixed effect. We can continue to the next slide. So our main results were quite interesting. We did find some evidence that Medicaid expansion influenced disability program take-up. In column 1, where we examined SSI take-up, we found that Medicaid expansion was associated with a 10% increase in 10% decrease in the take-up of SSI. We also found this to be significant at the 5% level. Looking at column 3, we found Medicaid expansion was associated with an 8% increase in SSDI take-up, as significant as a 1% level. This is, of course, consistent with our hypotheses that we discussed in the earlier slide. When we examine columns 2 and 4, we also find that some of these effects are more precisely estimated for certain racial and ethnic groups in our sample. When we look at column 2, we find that the change in SSI take-up was most precisely estimated for white and Hispanic respondents. For white respondents, we found that Medicaid expansion was associated with a 10% decrease in SSI take-up. And for Hispanic respondents, we found that Medicaid expansion was associated with a 20% decrease in SSI take-up. In column 4, we found that these effects were most precisely estimated for white and Black respondents. For white respondents, we estimated an increase in SSDI take-up among Black respondents. We could turn to the next slide. So to conclude, we find that Medicaid expansion did influence program take-up of SSI and SSDI. We found that it decreased SSI take-up by about 10% and increased SSDI take-up by about 8%. We also provide some evidence of heterogeneity by race and ethnicity, which we hope will encourage future examination of these differences in the disability literature going forward. While we're not directly able to test for the job loss or health insurance motivated disability enrollment mechanisms described earlier, we do try to examine job loss by examining the rate of employer-sponsored health insurance coverage reported in the CPS. We find that Medicaid ESHI of about 8%, which we argue is some evidence in support of the job loss hypothesis. We also believe that CPS is the best data available for our analysis, although we of course concede that our sample size is somewhat small. We argue that
Madeline?
Yes.
It seems like you're doing great, that you have about 4 minutes left. Just wanted to let you know.
Thank you so much. As I was saying, we argue that promoting larger data sets with better oversampling of minority groups, and particularly minority groups with disabilities, is going to be incredibly important to try to ascertain their experiences in the disability benefits programs and how their take-up may change in response to other, programmatic changes in health insurance, Medicaid expansions, for example. So thank you all very much for your time, and I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
Wonderful. Thank you, Madeline. And I am very sorry to everyone for my technical issue earlier. Hopefully you can hear me more clearly now. And I will turn the mic over to Isaiah O'Rear to present next. I just want to remind all the audience that hopefully we'll have time for about 15 minutes of Q&A. And so I really encourage you to enter your questions into the chat, where I'll be collecting those for the panelists. And Isaiah, the stage is yours.
Everyone, I hope everyone can hear me all right. So this morning I'll be presenting on recent state Medicaid expansions and the associations between those expansions and measured AIA and American Indian and Alaska Native health insurance access. Next slide. So to provide a reminder of the background, the Affordable Care Act, enacted in 2010 and implemented in 2014, included 2 provisions to expand health insurance coverage. So the creation of health insurance marketplaces, and also supported by some subsidies and regulations of private insurers, and then the Medicaid expansion program, which gave states the option to expand Medicaid coverage to families with incomes up to 138% of the federal poverty level. So these were the two main policies that were part of that effort to expand insurance coverage. Next slide. So access to health insurance for the AIN population was of special interest because of the population had high rates of uninsurance and lack of coverage prior to implementation of Medicaid expansion. So an analysis of American Community Survey data from the Kaiser Family Foundation found that 24% prior to the ACA had no health insurance coverage. And then about 2 years later, the uninsured AA rate was reduced to 17%. And this was with only 25 states even participating in the expansion in that first year. So this was only with half the states, there was still these drops in the uninsured rate. And then more recently, the National Indian Health Board, NIHB, has analysis has analyzed long-term trends using the 5-year ACS data sets. And so comparing the 5 years prior to the ACA and the most recent 5 years, they estimated that the national AIN insurance rate fell from about 24% to 15%. Next slide. So as of this past month, 41 states have adopted the Medicaid expansion. And as the time of this drafting this report, the most recent year of ACS data is from 2021. And so therefore, the most recent expansion states that has available post-expansion data would be Utah and Nebraska, because they adopted it in 2018, both through the referendum process with sort of resistance from the actual state legislatures and governors, but through the referendum process, the citizens of those states chose to adopt Medicaid expansion, and then those were implemented in 2020. So these two states, I thought, would be an interesting test case to look at trying to tease out some of the effects of Medicaid expansion on the AIN population for these recent changes. Next slide. So using the ACS 2019 and 2021 1-year data files, we see in Utah that the AIN uninsured rate dropped pretty dramatically. So we have, about 11% drop in uninsured rate, and that wasn't entirely all explained by an increase in Medicaid uptake, but there was an increase in Medicaid uptake of a couple percentage. And then similar results for the non-AIN population in Utah, but not as dramatic. However, in Nebraska, which also had this 2020 Medicaid expansion, very little change. So moving from 30.8 to 29.9, so about a 1% decrease in uninsured, and actually a 3% decrease in Medicaid uptake for that group, while the non-AIN population has this opposite effect happening, where uninsured rate goes down and the Medicaid uptake increases. So I don't really have an answer to this or a theory that would explain why the insurance coverage rates would have such differential outcomes in each state. But I tried to dig deeper into the data to try to tease this out a bit. So next slide. So when interpreting changes over time, such as the trends that other researchers have done, it's very difficult to kind of disentangle what's happening as a result of the state Medicaid expansion as compared to national conditions, such as the change in Medicaid eligibility policies from the pandemic, national economic conditions, changes in federal health policy that are affecting all states simultaneously. So to better understand the specific factors, I employed 2 logistic regression models on insurance coverage. So one model using the ACS 2019 data, which was prior to implementation of Medicaid expansion, and a second model using ACS 2021, which was post implementation of Medicaid expansion. So the expansion implementation happened during the 2020 calendar year in both these states. At this point, to simplify things, I used respondents who were over 19 and under 64 to avoid complications from CHIP policies, which would have different eligibility conditions, and Medicare policies as well. So everyone in between 19 and 64 were included in the analysis. Next slide. So to isolate the state-specific factors from national effects, I created binary variables for the 2 states. So one for Utah and one for Nebraska. So the variable is coded 1 if the respondent is in Utah and 0 if they were in anywhere else. And the sample includes the 49 states and District of Columbia, and the same thing with Nebraska. So creating binary dummy variables for each state. Next slide. I also included the AIN variable, and this is a simple binary variable that's coded 1 if the respondent self-identifies as American Indian or Alaska Native, and 0 if the respondent does not. And this is actually coded as 1 or coded as AIN, even if the respondent identifies with multiple other racial categories. So this would be called alone or in combination. So a lot of other analyses try to create mutually exclusive racial categories, and they end up taking about half of our AAN population who have also identified with other races and putting them in the multi-race category. And we lose a lot of valuable data, both in sample size. And so that's why it's a lot of our job as researchers of Indian health is to kind of reproduce existing analyses, but with a full count of the AAN population using the right variables, as opposed to using a derived mutually exclusive racial variable. And this is where this is more experimental or exploratory. I wanted to try to isolate the state level Indian health policy context. So whether it's explicit or not, each state has an Indian health policy that is separate from their regular health policy. And so this model includes an interaction effect between the state dummy variables and the AAN variable to isolate what is happening with health policy for AANs in that state. Next slide. And then also I included a control for whether the respondent is already has, quote, coverage by Indian Health Service. So in the ACS, there's a health insurance coverage question that lists most forms of medical insurance. So it would list Medicaid, Medicare, private insurance, but then it also lists IHS, Indian Health Service, as a type of coverage, and all of the similar situation with TRICARE for current military and Veterans Health Administration. So it's listed as a type of coverage, but when any insurance coverage variable is derived, that's the variable that is constructed from these other variables, IHS is not counted as insurance. So I wanted to leave it open and see if there might be some sort of crowding out effect, that if depending on the availability of IHS services, the users may not perceive a need for additional coverage through Medicaid or other insurances. So it's important. So I thought it was important to include in the model. It might depend on, it's kind of I think it's a poorly constructed question because it conflates health insurers and health insurance providers, because there's significant overlap in terms of IHS receives revenue from patients who are covered by Medicaid and Medicare. So there is that overlap, and it creates I think analysis problems the way it's currently designed. But that's something I wanted to be cognizant of. And I also, same thing, I don't know in terms of the IHS has the ITU system of IHS administered facilities, tribal administered facilities, and urban facilities, which are represented.
Hey, Isaiah?
Yeah?
You have 5 minutes left.
Okay. All right. So I won't go into too much depth over these variables. I'll get to the analysis. Thank you. Next slide. So this is the result of the regressions. I'll try to walk us through these. So keep in mind, these are 2 separate analyses for 2019 and 2021. And so in Utah, the odds of having health insurance for any Utah resident are higher than the rest of the country, not counting Nebraska here because that has its own dummy variable. The marginal effect at means, which is if every other variable is at their mean, what's the increased probability of having health insurance? And it's 0.7% for Utah residents in 2019, and that goes down actually a bit in 2021 as compared to the rest of the country. In Nebraska, even stronger effect with a 1.6% higher probability, and that actually increases quite a bit for in 2021. There is a national AIN disadvantage or penalty for having health insurance at about -1% in 2019, and that almost triples in 2021. And I'm not quite sure why there would be so much loss in coverage. And keep in mind, this is controlling for whether they are an IHS user or not. So it's not as if IHS is taking up the slack, and it's also controls for family income. So it's not a function of affordability of healthcare. There's another control in there. There's also age as well, so that the estimates are age adjusted. Now, the interesting thing is that the interaction variable, which is Utah times AIN, there is a -6.5% penalty for. You could think of these in two ways. You could think of this is among AIN population. If you're in Utah, you have 6.5% less likely to have health insurance. Or you could think of if you are in Utah and your AIN, the AIN population is 6.5% less likely to have health insurance. And that is in 2019, but that penalty vanishes from significance in 2021. So there's stars everywhere else. Most of them are significant at the 99% level. And the estimated effect is -1%, but that penalty specific to Utah decreases from 2019 to 2021. And this is something that suggests positive impact of the Medicaid expansion in Utah. While in Nebraska, it's the exact opposite. You have a slightly smaller Nebraska disadvantage or penalty, and that it's worse to be an AIN in Nebraska than other places. And then but that penalty gets increased in 2021. And the thing is, I see there's a question about loss of coverage between 19 and 21. So these models are for each year. So the comparison of these states are to other states in that year and not to 2021. So the idea is that it's the relative penalty during that year. So it shouldn't actually be an issue. In theory, if this worked out right, that the relative likelihood of having health insurance for each year should be able to control or take care of the fact that there was a pandemic and economic issues in that time. But yeah, in Utah, we did see that increase in coverage, that increase in probability of having health insurance, and basic increase of base coverage rates. And then in Nebraska, that increase of AIN penalty, despite having positive changes for the non-AIN. So I think that is everything I have, and I could look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Isaiah. That was perfectly on time. I want to make one more reminder for people to continue submitting your questions via the chat, and we'll save those for after all the presentations and discussants. And next, we'll turn over the stage to Chris Karbownik, who will be, thank you.
Great. Can you guys hear me? Okay. Yes. No.
We can hear you.
All right. Great. Thank you so much for having us to present this paper and for organizing this great conference. I know I have only 15 minutes, but one thing I just want to say is that big thanks to to the U.S. Census Bureau for the work they're doing now and the work that U.S. statisticians have been doing for the past 200 years. As researchers, we're just consumers of their products, and they're amazing, as you will see in this paper, where we try to understand the benefits of providing medical infrastructure to underserved communities. So if we can, that's a joint work with Alex Hollingsworth from Ohio State, Melissa Thomason from Miami, and Anthony Ray from University of Southern Denmark. So if we can jump the slide, please. So today's paper is going to be about the investments into health of local communities through building and modernization of hospitals. Is going to be in a historical context of the first half of the 20th century in the United States, in US South, in North and South Carolina. We're going to focus only on North Carolina today. We're going to try to understand whether these interventions, these improvements in infrastructure, can mitigate long-standing racial gaps in health outcomes. And then we're going to try to understand what happens when a hospital or improved supply of medical care is injected into a local community. Next slide, please. So why should you care? First of all, we spend a lot on healthcare today, and even historically, that was a major part of the governmental spending. Simultaneously, over the 20th century, we've seen massive declines in mortality, and there is this perception in economics and in medical fields that until modern medicine of the 1950s, 60s, the infrastructure really didn't play a crucial role. So what we're trying to figure out is it an era effect, or was it just the case that in many locations you just didn't have good enough healthcare? Whereas if you injected relatively modern medicine, even prior to 1950s and 1960s, you could see positive effects, and in particular, shrinking racial gaps in health outcomes. Okay, and this matters, even today, both in the United States and globally. In developing countries, many people still don't have access to basic healthcare, and in the U.S., if we can jump to the next slide. There is an ongoing discussion about rural healthcare. So you can think about the work we're doing as asking a question: what happens if you inject a first high-quality institution into a county, which can be a flip side of what's happening now? We're closing down rural hospitals, and so we feel that that's also relevant today. If we can jump to next slide, please. And so we're going to ask, how do hospitals and modern for-the-time medicine affect short and long-run health? And to the next slide. And in particular, can these interventions reduce a black-white mortality gap in the short run, and in the long run, the longevity gap? Do these improvements also change the medical sector, right? So do we see changes in the hospital infrastructure, and whether they persist over time? And then we're going to look at some labor market mechanisms, meaning if you improve the infrastructure, can you attract human capital? Can you attract higher quality physicians to the area? And the next slide, please. So we're going to do this in the context of a large-scale hospital modernization effort by the Duke Endowment in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s in the United States. We're going to mostly focus on late 20s to early 40s here, but the effects are also present until 50s. And then next slide. And so this was done in North and South Carolina. We only have data from North Carolina because mortality statistics don't really exist for South Carolina for that period, disaggregated by race. So, here you can see kind of the importance of what the Director Santos and Mita were talking about. Like, we really could use the disaggregated data in this case, but they just don't exist in historical context. And what Duke Endowment did is it built an expanded hospital. It obtained state-of-the-art medical technology for the time, and they refined management practices. Next slide, please. And this is going to be in the context of relatively low levels of health capital. So very high infant mortality rates. About 9% of Black infants died in the first year of life in our sample. Most of physicians were educated prior to Flexner reports with relatively low levels of medical knowledge. And generally, this was this prevalent view that hospitals were places to die rather than get the treatment. And the next slide, please. So these are our main effects. So I'm going to put results first, and then we'll see how much time we have to go through the details. So first of all, as a result of the intervention, we find about 50% increase in the number of hospital beds available in the county, about 15% increase in the number of hospitals, and about 10% increase in the number of doctors practicing in these counties. Oh, great. No, yeah, we can go 3 slides forward. Great. And so then what we see is we also see the substitution effect, right? So the Duke Endowment funding was restricted for not-for-profit or hospitals that offered free or highly subsidized care. And we see that these hospitals increase and their number of beds increase in these counties, and they substitute the proprietary hospitals that generally charge money and were very often inaccessible for African American population. For doctors, we also see that the inflow of doctors is disproportionate for what we call high quality doctors. These are doctors educated at more elite institutions or educated post Flexner report, where there were undergraduate requirements to get admitted to medical school, and small declines in low quality doctors. And then for the next slide. And so then we can look at what happens to infants in these regions. So we find about 6.5% declines in infant mortality. And next slide. This means that if we look at the intensive margin, we save one life in infancy for about $20,000, and that's rescaled to $2017. And so it's a very cost-effective intervention. And then the next slide. Importantly, we find much larger effects for African Americans, about 3 times larger. And so through this intervention, we sizably reduce the racial gap in infant mortality in the affected counties. And then the next slide. So we also look at later life mortality. So we trace these individuals to their place of birth and then look for them in the new midend in the 1990s and 2000 when they're about 56 to 64 year olds. So the treatment here is around the time of your birth. And we ask, if you're 56 to 64 and you got the treatment in your infancy, are you less likely to die than control group individuals who did not get the treatment? And indeed, we find 8 to 9% reductions also in later life mortality. And the next slide. But these are not differential by race. One explanation for that is the Black life expectancy for the cohorts we consider was low enough that many of them did not even survive to age 56. This is where we have to cut the data because of the data limitations. And so we have very positively selected sample of African Americans that make it to 56, 64. And that's why we think these effects are no longer different by race. And finally, if we can move to the next slide, we also investigate whether the infrastructure is complementary or substitute to innovation and technology. And so we get very lucky that throughout our rollout of Duke funding, we also have sulfa drugs being introduced. And so what we show is that in places where you got both the investment in infrastructure from Duke and access to sulfa, the reductions in infant mortality are about 3 times larger. So this suggests that medical investment in medical infrastructure and medical innovations are complements rather than substitutes. Okay, and to the next slide, please.
Chris,
So, yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just letting you know you have 5 minutes left.
Okay,
Thanks.
great. And next slide to the background. It's weird not to have control. So just to give you a sense, Duke Endowment was established in 1924. In the next slide, with an explicit, so when Duke died, his will, in his trust, he gave the money to the endowment, 40 million initially, and then 67 million in 1925. And 32% of that endowment and any dividends from the endowment are by law dedicated to the improvement of healthcare in North and South Carolina. And the endowment still functions today and funds the healthcare initiatives in these two states. And so then the next slide, please. And so what they did historically is they constructed new hospitals, expanded existing hospitals, and improved their quality as well as management. The important thing that you have to know from this is they, in the Jim Crow South, it had clearly biracial policy, and the assistance was supposed to be given whether to hospitals, whether white or colored. Okay, and this was both the inspiration and the model for the huge post-World War II hospital building program in the United States called Hill-Burton. And next slide, please. And next slide. So we're gonna skip this. Okay, so in terms of data, we did a lot of data work to make it happen, partially also thanks to the census data. So we're gonna use the annual reports of the Duke Endowment, the death certificates, individual level from North Carolina that we're going to aggregate it up, and then Social Security Administration numid file to get our long-run mortality. And we're going to get doctors' information from American Medical Directory and hospital from JAMA and from American Medical Directory. And next slide, please. So that's the obligatory slide in economic history talk at census. So we did digitize a lot of these records by ourselves. So next slide. So this is how they look like. So we transcribed all of this to get these data. Next slide, please. So you should know that a lot of the money was spent during the first and second year. But there is also about 10% of projects that applied for funding but never got the funding. And next slide, please. This is the death certificate that's been transcribed by John Perman and co-authors. So we use their data here. And next slide. These are the doctors, the information about doctors from American Medical Directories that we transcribe to get the sense of their where they practice, where they got education, and their quality. And then the next slide. And the same information for hospitals that we digitize. And then the next slide, please. And so let me just show you the variation, okay? So this is 1926, nothing is happening. And then if we can go to the next slide, this is by 1942. So what you see here is that we have these white counties. These are gonna be our control counties that never got treatment by Duke. And then different shades of pink counties. So these are counties that got treatment at different point in time. And this graph to the right basically shows you the rollout of the intervention. So we're going to use these as our, the counties that got the money as treatment group, and then the counties that never got the money or got money later as control group. And Nicole, if we can go to conclusions, because I'm way out of time, but I did convey a lot. So you're as Nicole's screening, you're seeing all the results. So I have way more slides than I can go through. But just to conclude, I think this is a really important intervention that to our knowledge has never been studied. It shows a proof of concept that even in the early half of the 20th century, modern for the time medicine could have been effective in reducing both infant mortality as well as benefiting these individuals in the long run. And primarily, when you think about infant mortality, it massively reduced the Black-white infant mortality gap, which even today is about 2x for African Americans compared to whites. And, this begs the question to what extent this is due to the fact that there is unequal access to healthcare, and even in modern setting for African Americans. Clearly, we show that even in the era of discrimination, in equalizing access to medical care could be very beneficial in reducing the racial disparities. In extremely cost-effective intervention where we save about one life for about $20,000 of investments, which is bargain compared to some of the other programs that have been studied, both historically and in modern settings. Thanks so much. I'm going to stop here, and thank you for all your subsequent questions.
Thank you so much, Chris. The data work you did on that project is really incredible. Again, keep submitting your questions. And next, we're going to turn to a presentation by Rachel Zidell.
So I'll be presenting research that I completed with some members of my lab here at the NIH, as well as some collaborators at the SOUL study, which is the data that we used for this study on differential exposure to discrimination stress as a mediator between racial identity and health among Hispanic and Latino individuals. So next slide, please. The underlying motivation for this work was the growing recognition that the current racial and ethnic paradigms that we use don't adequately reflect the identities of many Hispanic individuals in the US. So as you can see here, results from the US Census from 2020, more Latino individuals identified as some other race rather than choosing one or more of the other racial categories offered. So over 26 million Latino individuals, or about 40% of the Latino population in 2020, identified as some other race. And so it's likely that many of these individuals would have chosen to racially identify as Latino or Hispanic if given the option. But in the absence of that option, they, felt that some other race better captured their identity than one of these other options. And so this is a growing trend. This some other race category has been growing over the years, over the censuses. And so I was motivated to try to understand better, like who these individuals are, and then more broadly, what motivates racial identification within the Latino population, given that it's such a heterogeneous group of people. And as a health researcher, I also wanted to understand, like, what are the health implications of these different identities and the exposure to discrimination and, the health outcomes that can result from different identities. So next slide, please. So I started to dig into the literature on the health of Latino individuals by race, and this is an emerging body of work. There hasn't been too much done in this area, but there has been some, and it has been illuminating. And so work that has been done has shown that compared to white or perceived light skin tone Latino individuals, those that identify as Black or who interviewers perceive to have darker skin tone tend to have worse health outcomes. But within this small body of work, not all studies have found a significant relationship. Next slide, please. And one of the things that was missing from this work on the relationship between racial identity and health within the Latino population was looking at stress as a mediator between racial identity and health, which we know from the broader race and health literature is a mechanism that does affect health. So, but there is research that shows that Latino individuals are exposed to different stressors and different levels of stress based on their racial identities. And then separate work has found that exposure to discrimination stress in particular can undermine the health of Latino individuals. But there hasn't been work linking these two veins of thought. So it's not clear if differential stress exposure is what's generating disparities in health within the Latino population by race. Next slide, please. And so that's where our present study comes in. Our first objective was to identify the demographic predictors of self-identified race among Latino individuals, because there hasn't been much work at least not with empirical work, that has shown why Latino individuals choose different racial categories. But we theorize that it is related to social and demographic factors. So we first wanted to solve that like empirical puzzle first, but it also had a practical application to help inform our second objective, and specifically the covariates that were necessary to include in our mediation models. So our second objective was to test discrimination stress as a mediator between racial identity and health among Latino individuals, which you can see in our figure here with racial identity as our predictor variable. And it's directly related to health through path C, and then also indirectly related to health through paths A and B through exposure to stress. Next slide, please. To do this, we use the Hispanic Community Health Study / Study of Latinos, which is called SOUL for short. And SOUL is a multi-center prospective cohort study of Latino adults in the Bronx, Chicago, Miami, and San Diego. We use data from Visit 1, Visit 2, and the Sociocultural Ancillary Study, which had more questions. This ancillary study had a lot more questions about like social variables and like discrimination and things like that. And temporally, it happened on average within 4 months of Visit 1. So it's about the same time as Visit 1. Our predictor variable, again, was racial identity at Visit 1, which was the only time point it was measured. And we included 5 categories: American Indian, Alaska Native, Black, white, which was our largest sample, and therefore our reference group, multiracial, and unknown or not reported. And so we chose to include this final like residual category for a few reasons. Like one, right off the bat, it was the second largest group. And so it was about 40% of the sample at Visit 1, which theoretically we thought was interesting because given findings from the US Census, about 40% of the Latino population identifies as some other race. And so we thought that these individuals in this who either said they don't know what their race is or they decided not to answer the question, also likely racially identify as Hispanic and Latino. So we thought it was important to include these individuals instead of excluding them as missing data. Our mediating variable was stress exposure, measured at the Sociocultural Ancillary Study visit. And we chose to focus on discrimination stress, given that it is strongly associated with health and also racial identity. So we look at health at Visits 1 and 2. And since these are longitudinal models, we are able to capture change in depression symptoms, change in anxiety symptoms, and both diabetes and hypertension incidents. And our covariates listed here are from Visit 1. And they come from, knowledge of what is related to health, but also based on our initial preliminary models on the demographic correlates of racial identity. These would be covariates, the variables that we looked at that ended up being consistently and strongly related to racial identification. And therefore we chose to include in our mediation models. Next slide, please. So analytically, our first step was to explore the demographic correlates of racial identification at Visit 1 using multivariate multinomial logistic regression. And we had about, nearly 16,000 individuals because we were looking at the whole sample at Visit 1. And then second, we used generalized structural equation modeling to evaluate stress as a mediator between racial identity and health. And our mental health models had about 4,000 individuals. Because in order to be included, individual had to have been at Visit 1, Visit 2, and the Sociocultural Ancillary Study. So our sample sizes went down quite a bit. And then our diabetes and hypertension models have even lower sample sizes because we were measuring incidence and therefore excluded individuals who had a given condition at Visit 1. Next slide, please. So here's just a snapshot of some of the results from our demographic correlates of racial identification. Results are presented as relative risk ratios, which can be interpreted as having higher likelihood or greater risk of a given characteristic compared to our reference group, which was white identifying Latinos. And so just this segment of the table I chose to show because one of the themes that emerged from these models was that socioeconomic status was very predictive of racial identification. Next slide, please. So as you can see, individuals who identified as American Indian or Alaska Native, or who did not indicate a racial identity beyond Latino, were less likely to have higher levels of education compared to individuals who are Latino individuals who identified as white. Next slide, please. So a similar pattern emerged in terms of income, where individuals who identified as American Indian or Alaska Native, Black, or who did not indicate a racial identity were much less likely to have higher levels of income compared to those who identified as white. So again, first theme that emerged from these demographic correlates models was that socioeconomic status was associated with racial identification. Next slide, please. And so the second theme that emerged from these models was that elements of like geography or place were super important for racial identification. And so when we're talking about heritage in this sample specifically, about 70% of the respondents were first-generation immigrants. So heritage means for many people like where they used to live or where they were born at least. Next slide, please. And so there's a lot going on here, so I'm just going to highlight a few examples. And
Rachel,
the first,
I'm sorry to interrupt. Just letting you know you have 5 minutes left.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Okay, so as you can see here, individuals who identified as Black were much more likely to be Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central American, Dominican, or South American, rather than Mexican, again, compared to the white identifying group. Next slide, please. And next slide, please. Okay, and then the second thing I want to highlight here is that in non-statistical terms, individuals from the Bronx tended to be much more racially diverse compared to these other field sites, with one exception, and that is that there was an overrepresentation of Latino individuals who did not indicate a racial identity in Chicago compared to the Bronx. Next slide, please. All right, so our discrimination stress models, we use those results to help inform our covariates in these models. So these models all have many covariates included. And so the first piece of the puzzle that I want to highlight is that American Indian, Alaska Native, Black, multiracial, and racially unidentified individuals all reported higher levels of discrimination than white identifying Latinos. So that's like the first piece of the puzzle that's important to interpret these mediation results. The second piece of the puzzle is shown at the bottom. So next slide, please. And that is higher levels of discrimination stress were associated with greater increase in depression and anxiety symptoms and diabetes and hypertension incidence over time. So again, first piece, non-white identifying Latinos experience greater discrimination, and discrimination stress, second piece of the puzzle, discrimination stress was associated with worse health. Next slide, please. And so knowing that, it helps to interpret these indirect effects from our mediation models. And shown here is that identifying as American Indian or Alaska Native, Black, multiracial, or not indicating a racial identity beyond Latino was associated with greater increase in depression and anxiety symptoms over time compared to identifying as white, again, through the adverse effects of discrimination stress on health. Next slide, please. A similar pattern emerged in terms of physical health, and that is for identifying as American Indian or not indicating a racial identity was associated with greater diabetes incidence over time due to discrimination. And then identifying as American Indian or multiracial was associated with greater hypertension incidence over time because of discrimination. So overall, we did find that discrimination was mediating the relationship between racial identity and health for Latino individuals. And results were particularly strong for the American Indian identifying group, which was the group that actually reported the highest level of discrimination of all the racial identifying groups. And then also for mental health, discrimination seems to be particularly and most consistently associated with mental health. Next slide, please. So just to wrap up, we see this work as making at least two major contributions. The first is that social factors, particularly socioeconomic status, were most influential for Latino individuals' racial identities. And then second, we found that racial identity does predict differential exposure to stress. So how Latino individuals are racially identifying is associated with their exposure to discrimination. And that exposure to discrimination in terms shapes their health. And then, so I just want to end with like a final note to bring it back to the discussions we're having at the workshop today. And the first slide about, racial identity and questions we ask. We had some initial pushback about including this like unknown or not reported racial identity category. But we thought it was important to include because it's more of a statement on our inadequacy of current measures rather than like missing data per se. And so if we were to exclude that group, we wouldn't have found that a racially unidentified Latino group they did report greater discrimination, and that discrimination was associated with their mental health and risk of hypertension. So it's just important to keep in mind that the tools we use, especially to measure social constructs like race, can be important for what health disparities we're able to find and see. So thank you. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Rachel. You were getting a lot of agreement in the chat. And next, we're going to turn to our wonderful discussant, Kelvin Choi, who spent a lot of time thinking about all four of these papers and is going to share some remarks with us. Kelvin, you have 15 minutes as well.
For the invitation, I hope you all can hear me.
We can hear you great, thanks.
Okay, now let me put on the slideshow. My presentation is not much of a show. Well, okay, so thanks for the invitation and also all the presentations that have been done. These are four, I think, remarkable papers that address the different aspects of racial differences and ethnic differences in health disparity. I'm Kelvin Choi. I'm the Acting Scientific Director and a Senior Investigator at the National Institute of Minority Health Disparity Division of Intramural Research. And I'm trained as an epidemiologist. So my comment is part methods, also part context. So disclaimer, whatever I say is my opinion, doesn't reflect those of the government. You have questions, concern about my comments, you can email me and I'll answer your email. First off, what I want to point out is that race is there's an echo.
I'm not hearing an echo, Kelvin.
Okay, all right, then I'll continue.
You're good to keep going.
So what I want to start with is that race is the child of racism, not the father. Not that we have race first and then we have racism. Race is created because of the need of sustaining the privilege of a certain group of people in the society, and therefore race is created to sustain that privilege and racism follow. So we need to understand that the creation of race is for that reason. We live in a racialized society. When we look at education by race and ethnicity, we find that those who are identified as Asian and white have a higher proportion of them have advanced education, including bachelor's degrees and graduate degrees. When you look at the same numbers in Blacks and Native American populations, and also in Hispanic Latino, the numbers are much smaller. When we look at marital status, when you look at among Asian and white, you have more high proportion of them being reported as married couple. While when you look at Black in particular in this situation, you have many fewer people of them reported actually as married couple. And then of course it has impact on life expectancy. When we look at life expectancy by race and ethnicity, we consistently see that Asians are having longest life expectancy, and there's some discussion about what's the reason behind it. But then when you look at the Black American Indian, Alaska Native, they are often and persistently having shorter life expectancy than the general population. So, and we also have to understand that the concept of intersectionality, that the effect of race also depends on other social, commercial, on political determinants, and again goes back to the idea there's a power dynamics and power structure that's in place with the intersection of these identities and circumstances that create the outcome that we see. So I'm going to talk about the paper in slightly different order and kind of in framing of a bigger picture. So when we look at what been just presented, Rachel's paper looking at the racial identity, discrimination, and health among Hispanic Latino individuals, she's trying to look at demographic correlate. I mean, I wouldn't call them predictors because I think, as I've mentioned, racial identity drives from these social circumstances. And so what you see in terms of the outcome and income and education and so forth, those are potential result of the racial and ethnic identity, not the cause of those. And then in aim 2, she tried to look at the racial identity effect on race, on discrimination experience, not stress, it's reporting experience, and on health outcomes. And it shows that having a racial identity in addition to an ethnic identity as Latino and Hispanic may link to additional discrimination and subsequently worse health outcome, particularly in terms of mental health. And this is in line with what we have seen from other data set, which also has been mentioned in the chat. The idea of the street race, that when you, and I'm showing data from Pew Research Center, even when they are self-identified as Latino and Hispanic, if they're being identified, it's the different generations here, that they have different experience in terms of their discrimination. Similar data has also been shown in terms of if they've been identified by others as Black or as white, their experience of discrimination vary quite a bit. So that's, I think, is in line with what we already know, and is helpful to see additional data to support that. I think the challenge is to interpret the actual racial identity among the Hispanic Latino individuals when they report a ethnicity of Hispanic or Latino and then report race. So I have two examples here. They're kind of hypothetical, but it's also reflect the complexity of the issue. So when somebody reported being identified as or self-identified as Hispanic, Latino plus Black, is the person a Afro-Caribbean, which like Jamaican, which in that case might just be a monoracial person? Or is that person reporting having both Black and Latino heritage, or maybe if the father is identified as Black and the mother identifies as Latino, then that person is a biracial person. And then another hypothetical situation is that when somebody identified as Hispanic, Latino, and American Indian and Alaska Native, is the person identified as someone who is part of the indigenous population in South America, and in that case, that would be a monoracial person. Well, it can also be that the person is reflecting on the fact that the father is a Latino, but the mother is for example, American Indian and Alaska Native, and in that case, that person is biracial. So how do we understand these additional ethnic and racial identity when they in combination, and what exactly are we trying to measure? I think that's the questions we need to ponder upon. And I think the data Rachel presented provided some clue, but not really clear in terms of which one of these interpretation we can lean on. For example, when we look at the Black population, a lot of them identify as Puerto Rican, and also like Central American and Dominican. So those seems to lean more on, if somebody identify Hispanic and Black, they might be more likely to be Afro-Caribbeans, but not necessarily all of them. So how do we understand the heterogeneity even within that group? And I'm going to move on to O'Hare's presentation, sorry, on Medicaid expansion and AIN health insurance coverage. I would say it's not necessarily access. I think in the questions that he was trying to answer was what explained the difference between changes in American and Alaska Native insurance coverage in 2 states, both expand Medicaid around the same time, but somehow having very different movement in the coverage rate. And I think a couple of questions I have in mind in terms of the analytics is that should the analysis be limited to those who are eligible for Medicaid only? And would that lead to a different type of results? And instead, the interaction between AIA and state the best model to test and to address this research question? Or alternatively, should we look at the similarity and the differences between the American Indian, Alaska Native living in Utah versus living in Nebraska? What might be the differences? Maybe in sex distribution, maybe education, maybe employment, or living on reservation. That may have some impact on helping us understand what may drive the differences in the changes in the coverage of health insurance. And the other way to do it, maybe do a mediation model, looking at whether residing in Utah versus Nebraska and through some sort of mediator to change the actual coverage status. So those are analytical considerations that may help us better understand what may drive differences in the differential trend in the changes in health insurance. And what is interesting that IHS users are less likely to have health insurance coverage, and I think the speaker spoke to this as one of the explanation, and I see that maybe that's also the place that can be a key venue to sign people up for Medicare, that really help them, make sure that they have health coverage in addition or to having the service from IHS. And I think at the end, that also raises another question: is that does enrolling Medicaid after the expansion have better health status than those who actually only use IHS? Or we need to make sure that we're barking up the right tree, right? We want to make sure that the insurance coverage lead to actually access to healthcare that really improve health outcome. And so a lot more questions there to actually further examine what might be the insurance coverage increase or decrease means in the health outcome of these individuals. Moving on to the third paper, looking at Medicaid expansions and the take-up of disability benefit by race and ethnicity.
Kelvin?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Just letting you know you have 5 more minutes.
Thank you. So the goal number 1 of the paper is to use a more stringent approach to identify SSI and SSDI eligible individual, which I find, is interesting, and is, I think, useful to include the workability as part of the definition. And then the goal number 2 is to look at how Medicaid expansion relate to the SSI, SSDI uptake by race and ethnicity. Reading through the paper and hearing about the presentation, what I appreciate the most is it's hard work to be poor, and it's even harder work to be poor with a disability. When you think about the definition of the inclusion eligibility criteria of like SSI and SSDI, and all I list them here, you have to have below a substantial gainful activity, and God help us to find that definition. Well, there is one there, but if someone you're in a financially disadvantaged population and have a disability, to fill out those forms, understanding those definitions, probably not so easy. And then it has criteria related to your employment history, and then depends on the program, you have different amount of benefit you actually receive, and also have different implication for your Medicaid and Medicare coverage. And I think there are additional analytic considerations that I would suggest. For example, should or can the analysis be limited to people eligible to these benefits by income or by work history? And knowing that the unemployment rate vary by race and ethnicity, how does that additional inclusion and exclusion criteria may or may not impact the results that we're seeing here? And how does citizenship and permanent residency status impact eligibility for the benefit? And as we can see here, looking at the data, when we look at Asian and Hispanic Latino population, a larger proportion of people in these two racial ethnic groups are non-citizens by race. And that means they might not be, and my understanding is they're not eligible for these benefits. So how does that play out when you consider, among Asians and Latinos that are eligible, would there be differences in the results that we're seeing? And then the additional thoughts on the finding is that the uptake on SSID by race and ethnicity, how does it affect when we look at the long-term unemployment by race and ethnicity? Does it affect the uptake? And also, I'm kind of concerned about the interpretation of the workforce participation, because when the definition includes the ability to work, that means they're not able to work. And how does that impact how we actually understand the results about workforce participation given the expansion? Lastly, I'm going to talk about the Chris paper looking at the investment in healthcare system and improvement in health. I think this is a wonderful example showcasing that, racism is reversible. And I pull out some of the figures that when we look at how much the investment actually reduced the disparity in infant mortality by within each racial group. I think that's really a hopeful finding that racism is reversible, and the effect of racism on health is reversible. Can the result be replicated today? And I'm pulling some of the challenges we have today. These are data showing, for example, type of hospital beds per 1,000 individuals by race. We see that in some of the, for example, Black individuals actually have higher number of hospital beds compared to white, but at the same time, they have fewer number of staff per bed. So what does that mean? So are we actually not necessarily we need to increase the number of beds, but we need to increase the number of staff per bed, because those increase is important in terms of improving hospital quality and patient safety. When we look at type 3 and 4 pressure ulcer by race, and we found that Black individuals actually more likely to experience type 3 and 4 pressure ulcer. And when you look at post-op sepsis, both Black and Hispanic individuals actually have a higher rate of getting post-op sepsis than white individuals. So it's not just the beds, but it's also the quality of the care and the number of people serving these groups. And I also questioned, where's the data for Asian American Indians, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders, and how do immigrant status affect these findings? And what kind of structural changes and investment are needed to address the disparity in healthcare and health today? I think those are questions that the data kind of suggests there might be a hopeful solution, but I think we need to better understand what are the solutions. I'm going to skip over this. To the point that I want to conclude is that why do we still measure race today? And because race, while it's socially constructed, it has real consequences. And how do we measure race now is insufficient to understand disparity in all aspects, including social, economic, and health. And we need to understand the structural and social manifestation of racism to really find out how do we solve these problems. And I want to bring it back to the idea of intersectionality. People are complex, and we have multiple identity, and all these axes integrate and interact together to affect the outcome that we see. So we need to better understand those as well. With that, I'm going to stop.
Thank you, Kelvin. That's really comprehensive and helpful. I think we have just under 10 minutes to get to some of the great questions that have been coming in. The first is for Isaiah, and the question is essentially echoing what I had myself. That you find this very Am I cutting out again?
Yes, Nicole, there's a lot of static on your line currently. It's difficulty.
Thank you. Is this better?
That sounds much better, Nicole. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, first question for Isaiah about, you have this very persistent finding that, before and after the Medicaid expansion in Utah, the uninsured rate went down versus in Nebraska, where we don't find any change. And the question was about whether or not looking at this American Indian, Alaska Native population as a whole is masking some kind of heterogeneity within that might explain both the results in Utah and Nebraska. In particular, there's interest in whether or not these individuals are living on a reservation or not, and if that differs across the two states. So can you speak to that you're able to look at in your data, or even just theories of what you would do with more data?
That is helpful. I did try to address that question with the IHS usage a little bit, but there is a separate variable in American Community Survey, which is the homeland variable, which is whether the resident is in a census block that's in a AIN homeland area, which is a rough proxy for on reservation. After getting that question in the chat, I did run the numbers and saw that most of the increase in Medicaid coverage in Utah came from residents who were on reservations, but I could see rerunning this model with a on reservation variable, and just hopefully there isn't multilinearity with the other things that are very similar. But yeah, that's a good suggestion, and I can add that as I revise it to sort of tease out what differences there might be in terms of that reservation status, in addition to IHS usage.
Thank you. Incredible you were able to run that fast. The next question is for Rachel. There, in the first part of your kind of aim one, or the first research question in your presentation, was looking at what explains these different racial identities within the Hispanic and Latino population. And it seems like a lot of your findings centered on the social and economic characteristics. And there's a question in the chat about immigration status and other kind of first, second, third generation immigrant, and how that might explain things, and whether you were able to look at that in your data.
Yeah, so we did look at various immigration-related factors because I theorized that those would be the things that are driving different identities, because theoretically you would expect, especially in a predominantly immigrant population, as the sample we used was, that you come to the US and then you start to get to become more familiar with the racial categories we use here, which are very different than racial categories used in other countries. And so I expected that immigration-related factors like immigrant generation, we did look at that. Years lived in the US, we did look at that. And things like that would be associated with racial identity, but they were not, at least, the models we used had all these other variables in it, like socioeconomic status. So at least they were not associated with racial identity after, having these other socioeconomic status variables in the model. So I think that's why we chose to highlight like socioeconomic status and like place, like where you live, as the important variables, because the immigration related factors were not associated upon controlling for these other factors. But we did look at it because that's what I initially thought would be predictive or associated. So thank you.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting to hear, and appreciate you being honest about your priors. There's only 2 minutes left. I want to ask one more question to Chris. There some more of a comments than questions coming in. People are very excited about your findings. And one question I have is, you find that there's a disproportionate reduction in this infant mortality for in the Black population. And I'm curious if you've thought further about why that may be. Of course, it's possible that there's just differential need at baseline, but I do recall a finding about that it seemed like hospitals were able to not just recruit more qualified doctors, but disproportionately more qualified Black doctors. And perhaps maybe there's something with racial concordance going on there, or any other reasons you and your co-authors have kind of kicked around about why this disproportionately benefited the Black population.
Great question. So I think, issue number one is this policy actually facilitated, access to hospital care for many of the Blacks, especially in more rural places. Absent the policy, perhaps the only hospital there was either not available or not admitting African Americans because it was whites only. Again, the policy was explicitly biracial, and something like 90% of funding went to places that allowed the treatment for both whites and African Americans. That's not to say that the care was not segregated. It was still segregated, but at least there was an access to the care. And then secondly, you're absolutely right. One of the findings that we do see is that there is also an increase in African American doctors coming into those locations, and especially African American doctors educated post Flexner and or in institutions that required at least some basic education to get to medical school. So we think about these doctors as being higher quality or at least better trained on paper. And there is definitely a lot of research on racial concordance, albeit at least in economics is fairly limited. So I definitely think that part of the story is, you can get to the doctor, but also the doctor is of your same race, so maybe they can address your problems better, or they will just treat you better. Does that make sense?
That does, it really does. And it brings us right to time. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to our questions for Madeline, but I'll send you those separately. And I just want to quickly thank everyone for your input today. And I'm looking forward to our next session, which will be chaired by Rachel Marks. So thanks again.
Thank you, everyone. We're going to have a quick break, and we hope that you all will tune back in for the second session. Right now, we're going on to a break for about 10 minutes, and we'll reconvene at 11:25. Thank you.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but free people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations.
I had no idea that church I was running by every day was something my grandfather established.
This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
You know, Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total black population in California is about 2.6 million, and then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, you know? But I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Overnight, it's like, oh, it's no longer the quarters, now it's Lincoln Heights. Oh, so now we get to use Abraham Lincoln for our name. And you think about all the other people that they could have used, but they picked Lincoln. And I think that's sort of a stereotypical of what they do.
There wasn't any black restaurants. As far as black business and weed, it wasn't none.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Why has it been easier for other groups than us?
Because of anti-black hatred.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR room, don't tune in.
I'm pleased to be here with you this morning at this important conference, chairing the session on theorizing racial and ethnic identities and measurement. So we have two great presentations today, followed by our discussant, Mary Campbell, and then we'll have time for your questions. So please remember to submit your questions throughout the presentations and we'll get to them at the end of this session. So our first presentation this morning will be from Mosi Adesina Ifatunji from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So Mosi, I'll turn it over to you.
Hear me because I'm not. There we go. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir, we can.
All right. We got a fair amount of dense material here. I'm going to try to read through it. I'm not the best reader, but I think that in order for this thing to make sense, I've got to read it. And so we'll try to get through as soon as possible, as quickly as possible. Next slide. So I first want to begin with these epigraphs, which essentially lay out the argument for my paper here today. In the first epigraph, which I won't read here right now, we're quoting from Du Bois in his 1897 essay, The Conservation of Races, where he's developing a social ontology for the study of race. And you can see here that he also includes markers that we might otherwise consider ethnic markers. Next, we have Weber, who, while we generally give him credit for developing our ethnic ontology, he also includes notions of physical type in his definition. And then we have Alain Locke, a philosopher, not widely cited or noted, I should say, who shows that basically race and ethnicity, or race and culture, basically operate in an iterative fashion or recursive fashion and can't be separated. And then finally, we have Robert Park, who puts out the bold claim that race relations and all that they imply are generally and on the whole the products of migration and conquest. Next slide. I'm over here pushing buttons. So one of the central issues in the study of race and ethnicity is ontology. That is, after at least a century of social scientific inquiry, we continue to debate definitions for these terms. While there's broad agreement that both are socially constructed, the debate is continuing. What is race? What is ethnicity? Are they the same? Are they different? There's a whole bunch of contributions, and there's there's kind of a summary of all these debates in two recent issues of the Journal of Ethnic Racial Studies. Next slide. As this debate continues, there's been a 25-fold increase in use of the term ethno-racial between 1985 and 2001. Next slide. And yet we currently do not have a well-defined formal ontology for this term. For their part, Valdez and Golash-Boza present instructive challenges to such an integrative framework, offering that race and ethnicity are distinct concepts that bring different relationships and perspectives to bear on pressing social issues, and that an integrated framework centered on ethno-raciality or the ethno-racial core sounds promising, but tends to fall short because it lacks clarity with regard to how ethnicity and race fit together. Next slide. These kinds of concerns are likely contributing to what appears to be a near flattening in the use of the ethno-racial term since 2001. Next slide. It is within this context that I'm calling for the formal development of an ethno-racial ontology for the study of race and ethnicity in settler and colonial societies. Below, I identify three issues that necessitate such an ontology: dual paradigms in the study of race and ethnicity, long-standing ontological overlaps, and the reliance on totalities for concepts in the social sciences. Considering certain anomalies that I've stumbled upon in my comparative studies of African Americans and Black immigrants, I conclude the essay arguing that race and ethnicity fit together because they share the same fundamental cause: human migration. Next slide. So we'll begin with the dual paradigm problem. So one of the biggest issues in the study of race and ethnicity is that many believe that we require distinct paradigms to study these two. As a reminder, scientific paradigms pair ontologies with theories. Ontologies define the entities that exist within paradigms, while theories or assumptions describe, explain, or anticipate relationships between entities in paradigms. Therefore, paradigms for the study of race and ethnicity require an ontology that offers a singular rule set for parsing and or identifying group entities, and a set of theories that anticipate or explain intergroup relations, inequalities, and stratifications. Next slide. Within the race paradigm, our group ontology most often relies on physical characteristics, including but not limited to skin color, hair texture, bone structure. Within the ethnicity paradigm, our group ontology most often turns on certain proxies for cultural characteristics, including but not limited to language, religion, and political geography. Given current norms, if we are studying the incorporation or social closure processes, we should then be using different paradigms with different ontologies for defining rules for different rule sets for defining group entities. As I review below, it seems as though the practice of using dual paradigms for the study of race and ethnicity is rooted in historical happenstance, ideological commitments, and collegial loyalties. Next slide. In stepping over ontology and focusing on theories that describe, explain, or anticipate intergroup processes, social scientists mechanically bind certain social processes with specific kinds of group entities, resulting in ad hoc ontological switching and confusion. That is, the ontological underpinnings of sociological theories are chosen pragmatically and confirmed by the empirical process of these theories. So, under dual paradigms, incorporation is an ethnic process and social closure is a racial process, but incorporation and closure are theories of intergroup relations, not ontologies for group entities or their boundaries. The practice of selecting ontologies based upon the social processes we observe requires the same group be defined as either a race or ethnicity, depending on whether they are experiencing this or that social process in this or that social context. Next slide. And so the next big problem is the problem of ontological overlap. The history of science here suggests that paradigmatic purification began sometime in the opening decades of the 20th century. To revisit the historical context, in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, the United States Supreme Court relied entirely on a biological ontology for race to install Jim Crow. Plessy, the petitioner, argued that he was 7/8 Caucasian and 1/8 African blood, that the mixture of colored blood was not discernible in him, and that he was entitled, therefore, to every right, privilege, and immunity secured to citizens of the United States and of the white race. In response, the court determined that Plessy was Black, stating that he had the proportion of colored blood necessary to constitute a colored person. And so, despite Plessy appearing white to many, to the court, he was Black. Next slide. Writing in the immediate wake of Plessy, in his essay, The Conservation of Races, W.E.B. Du Bois provides the first effort at a socially ontological rule set for racial group entities, marking out what we now call phenotype. And I won't read the quote here, but he's basically talking about skin color, hair texture, bone structure. Next slide. Du Bois here is thinking through the problematic that while we think of Black people as having a specific and more narrow distribution of certain phenomic features, many do not share these features. And so the classification must be based more on subjective beliefs than on a fact-based reality. Moreover, he includes languages in his racial ontology, saying that race has historically been marked by skin color, hair, cranial measurements, and language. And he offers kind of a vision of kind of shared culture and values, et cetera, and so forth, which we might think about as kind of a cultural form. Next slide. Although both the court, so you can see Du Bois is working with both physical and non-physical cues or markers of this construct he wanted to call race. Although both the court and Du Bois offered racial ontologies that decentered phonomics, in his 1922 essay, Ethnic Groups, Max Weber offers an ontology for group entities in his effort to understand the intergroup dynamics occurring in the wake of large-scale inflows of immigrants from Europe to the United States. Although many have critiqued Weber for his focus on so-called whites, his ontology retains a role for phonomics, saying that ethnic groups are those human groups that entertain a subjective belief in their common descent because of similarities of physical type or customs or both. Moreover, he also posited that apart from language and apart from religious belief, the ethnic differences that remain include aesthetically conspicuous differences in the physical appearance. These clear early ontological overlaps in both Du Bois and Weber birthed early confusion. Next slide.
Mosi, just letting you know you have about 5 minutes.
Yep. Immediately following Du Bois and Weber, the philosopher Alain Locke in his 1924 essay describes essentially recursive overlaps that would prohibit clear distinctions between race and ethnicity. And here he's basically talking about those overlaps. This is why at the close of the 20th century, many found helpful work to try to begin parsing these concepts. And that's the quote here by Cornell and Hartman. But more recently, we have a bunch of people figuring in ethnic ontologies in the process of racialization. Next slide. So my efforts to understand why Black immigrants do better than African Americans in the United States has resulted in anomalies that are not anticipated by normative ontologies for race and ethnicity under dual paradigms. Next slide. That is, since both groups are classified as Black, most studies draw on theories of population difference to explain better outcomes for Black immigrants. However, a number of studies have shown discrimination or bias that favors Black immigrants. And so these kinds of findings are not anticipated by classical theories of racism, anti-Blackness, skin color, or anti-immigrant bias. Next slide. And so here I begin drawing on ethno-racism theory in order to make sense of all this. And it's a theory that postulates that racialized relations between migrants and non-migrants often reflect the broader context of the core periphery relationships between immigrant state of origin and the United States, resulting in forms of social closure that include ethnicity, culture, national origin, and the historical relationship between minorities' country of origin and the country of settlement that have been racialized. This next quote here is me just saying that by using the comparative studies of African Americans and Black immigrants, I kind of provide a quasi-experimental design, which holds Black phenomics constant, and therefore I'm able to develop a theory of ethno-racialization, which describes the assignment of racialized meanings to people and populations based on both physical and non-physical characteristics. Next slide. Right, and so the way this works out is that because African Americans are descendant of American slavery, they get stereotyped one way because foreign-born Blacks are associated with countries that are outside the scope of American colonial enterprises. They get racialized as model minorities. And this all happens despite them both sharing the same Black phenomics. Next slide. Totalities. So basically, people have tried to fix this problem of dual paradigms, et cetera, and so forth by offering either an intersectional framework or ethnic ontology. This is a bunch of quotes from dignitaries in the field, but basically the intersectional framework, as you can see below there, argues that race and ethnicity work separately and together. Next slide. And so social scientists generally work with totalities. What a totality means for a concept is that if a chair is a chair today in this room, it has to be a chair in the next room, it has to be a chair tomorrow, it has to always be a chair. However, if a chair is known, becomes known or recognizable as a stool, say for example, when somebody stands on it, it's no longer an ontological totality. That is, it has to always be known as a chair. It can't be known as a stool and a chair. With respect to these questions, according to these dictates of normative social science, religion is religion, not race or ethnicity. And basically, there's some new theorizing on assemblages that basically allows us to build a seamless whole out of this. I can say more in the Q&A. Next question. Next slide. And so therefore, I invite debate regarding the limitations associated with the reliance on totalities for ontologies in the social sciences. And for my part, I posited the emergent metaphysical philosophy of assemblages to develop ethno-racial assemblages. And here are some quotes from me arguing this in previous work. Next slide. And finally, great, this is the part of the paper. This is a paper that's underway and not finished, but this is the part that's the least finished. So given limits of dual paradigms, the continuing presence of ontological overlaps, and the ways in which our reliance on totalities has limited efforts toward a singularity, I want to begin again by offering migration in the development of both racial and ethnic ontologies. After a close reading of all the literature in this area, which I've been doing for some time, I'm going to argue that race and ethnicity fit together because they share the same fundamental cause, human migration. Here, I build out migration as a fundamental cause of all these kinds of perceptions, classifications, identities, etc. And I also kind of expand the definition of migration to include not only international migration, but migration between any kind of political geographies, right? It can include states or other municipalities. And also colonial situations that are all fit under the scope of forms of migration. Next slide. Here is a part of the paper that's not developed. That was just on what is fundamental cause theory. And basically the idea of fundamental cause is that it's present in every case, right? So I'm arguing that in every case where we find ethno-racial formations, migration is there, either in the actual historical record or through stories that are told. And so here are just some quotes featuring the role of migration in some of the early thinkers. Next slide.
Mosi, I'm going to have to ask you to give your final thoughts in just a moment.
That's right. Just go to the next slide. And that's it. So my final thought here is that basically, given this theory, I'm able to move away from the use of arbitrariness for markers of race and posit a specific and limited set of ethno-racial markers, thereby stipulated. And we can talk more in the Q&A. Sorry for running over.
Thank you. Thank you for that great presentation. A lot of interesting thoughts in the chat. We'll get to that at the end. So next up, we're going to welcome Christopher Irwin from Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand. And just as a reminder, if you have questions, please drop them into the chat and we will get to them at the end of the session. All right, Chris.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is Christopher Irwin. I'm at Auckland University of Technology. Today, I'm presenting some joint work with co-authors in both New Zealand and the US. The title of this paper is Identifying Adult Populations at Promise for Literacy and Numeracy Interventions, Valuing Cultural Wealth Using Intersectionality. Next slide, please. So we're using a lens of critical race theory and intersectionality for this paper, and I wish that I had time to discuss in detail some of the tenets and principles that we embody in this work. But unfortunately, due to time constraints, I'm going to have to somewhat gloss over this. But I do want to mention what's in bold on the screen there, the concept of do no harm. This is particularly salient to this work as we are discussing Indigenous populations within New Zealand, specifically Maori and Pacific peoples populations. And so in no way is this work meant to be taken to propagate negative stereotypes about different groups in society. Next slide, please. So just a little background. The beginnings of this paper started with disagreement over the use of the term low skill, which you find a lot in the area of adult literacy and numeracy, which is what we're focusing on today. using the term low skill is not helpful for building a rapport with research subjects or communities. And even more importantly, it's not respectful. And so using the term low skill is a sort of deficit framing that we see that this language is I guess you could say it's the norm in a lot of research of adult literacy and numeracy proficiency. And so what we've done in an attempt to move away from this deficit framing language, instead of using the term low skill, we're using the term at promise. And this has been done in previous literature, and I'll discuss in subsequent slides sort of why at promise is a fitting term, we believe. But it's also important to realize that in studying literacy in particular, really we're holding up individuals to a very Anglo-centric standard of literacy proficiency. And specifically within the New Zealand context, when we're discussing the Maori community, the Maori have a very rich cultural history of having an oral language, which was, only relatively recently written down by colonists. So we're essentially taking one hat and we're trying to fit it on a subject where we know it's not going to fit. So I just wanted to say those couple of points up front so we can keep those in mind when we start looking at results. Next slide, please. Also, something that deserves a bit of attention is the way ethnicity is defined within New Zealand. Here I have a definition from Statistics New Zealand, and they're very clear that ethnicity is about identification. It's a culture that people feel that they belong to. It's self-perceived, and it's distinct from concepts of race, ancestry, nationality, etc. Next slide, please. So generally, in our context, but also in a broader sense, when researchers are interested in across group disparities in outcomes, such as literacy proficiency, for example, a lot of times you'll see researchers just throwing things like ethnicity, gender, and class on the right-hand side in a regression and running the regression and seeing what pops out. But in doing so, it's important to note that we're making some implicit assumptions. The first being that there is some sort of universal Maori experience or Pacific people's experience, which we know is something that does not exist, right? That's not individual's reality, if you will. And this is related to what Zuberi calls the fallacy of assuming that a person's race causes an outcome. Now, the method that we use is essentially we're decomposing differences in group means. So our results in this paper are no more causal than just comparing sample means. And I think that needs to be said up front, and we need to be abundantly clear about that. But second, and perhaps just as important, when we're putting in these characteristics on the right-hand side and we're not interacting them, what we're doing is that we're assuming the independence of different statuses such as ethnicity, gender, and class. And so those that are living at multiple marginalized parts of society with multiple marginalized social statuses, this sort of approach prevents those narratives, prevents their stories from being told through the data. Next slide, please. And so what we're doing is just extending this sort of traditional basic regression approach from the previous slide, and we're allowing for the simultaneity and interdependence of items such as ethnicity, gender, and class to help reveal a more realistic, but also more complex landscape of inequality that is otherwise hidden. So you'll see here in equation 2, rather than just having these main effects of ethnicity, gender, and class on the right-hand side of the equation, we're allowing all of their possible interactions. And this allows the researcher to see how the Maori or Pacific experience is actually dependent upon the interaction of these statuses rather than their independence. And this is what has been called this allows us to examine the checkerboard of racial progress and retrenchment. And not only is this intersectional approach more realistic, but in terms of public policy interventions, it may allow a more fine-tuned, targeted approach for redistribution of resources or launching public programs to improve literacy or numeracy in our case. Next slide, please. So the data that we use come from OECD. This is known as their PAC data. That's the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies. This program measures literacy and numeracy in the adult population. I believe they measure or they sample individuals ages 16 to 65. So if you just look at overall country level results, you'll see that New Zealand fares relatively well within the group of OECD nations. Next slide, please. And so here I've just highlighted New Zealand and the US, since I know that I'm speaking to a lot of my American brethren here during this at this conference. And so in terms of literacy, New Zealand actually scores quite well, right? We come in 4th overall within the OECD, behind Japan, Finland, and the Netherlands, where the US is sort of in the middle of the pack. Next slide. Now in numeracy, it's as if you take New Zealand and US and you just shift them down in the OECD distribution. So here we have New Zealand in the middle of the pack, and we have the US quite a ways down the distribution, actually 4th from the bottom within the OECD. Next slide, please. But just comparing these averages at the country level is really ignoring the distribution within country, and that's what we're most interested in. So just to preview some of the takeaways, when we take an intersectional approach within New Zealand, we find that low-income Maori men are nearly 12% more likely to be characterized as at promise for literacy interventions compared to the reference group, in our case, which is high socioeconomic status non-Indigenous men. referencing the role of gender and class. And so if we're merely just throwing money at ethnic groups in a broad sense, we're missing the complexity, and also we may be misallocating funds, right? We might be able to better target using the results of this intersectional investigation. Next slide, please. I guess I wanted to finish with this slide because these methods are becoming more popular. There was a recent article published in Race, Ethnicity, and Education, which sort of surveyed the different publications that use similar methods. And one thing that I think is glaring in this literature is in step one of our approach, when we're looking at the coefficients on interaction effects, they're not easy to digest. And because they're not easy to digest and understand, it's difficult to turn these results into public policy. And so I think there needs to be additional work to focus on the coefficients on these interaction terms and use things like the laws of conditional probability to sort of see if there's a better way of conveying and communicating these results to policymakers. And with that, I thank you for your attention and I look forward to the questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christopher, for that great presentation. So next, I'd like to invite our discussant, Mary Campbell from Texas A&M University, to share her remarks on these two presentations. And then as a reminder, please continue to post your questions into the chat. Thank you to those of you who have already done so. It's pretty lively in there, so I look forward to a great discussion after Mary's remarks. Mary?
Great, thank you so much. I am also looking forward to the Q&A. I think this will be a wonderful discussion because these are two very interesting papers. So I want to first start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to discuss these. It was lots of fun to read these. I learned quite a bit from that. And I want to thank the authors for some really interesting contributions. So these two very thoughtful papers are very different and have very different goals, but they're wrestling with some of the same practical and theoretical questions. So I'm going to talk about the two papers separately, but I will highlight a few ways that they connect in ways that aren't entirely obvious from their presentations. So in the same order the authors just presented, I'll start with Mosi's work on developing an ethno-racial ontology. So in this paper, he's arguing that processes of racialization and ethnogenesis are both a result of human migration, which combines international migration and colonialism and other processes. So they're reflecting a singular process, even while we usually mark them differently. And in the beginning of this paper, he points out how conceptually unclear we often are when we talk about race and ethnicity in research. And he points out that this is both in the past and in current work, that it's not new that we are conceptually unclear, that this is in the origins, as we saw in a lot of the quotes that he presented today, but also has an amusing footnote that points out that a lot of the work that we're writing now also doesn't really define what we are talking about, that people will launch into studies of race or studies of ethnicity with relatively little discussion of what those terms mean in many cases. And I definitely felt this footnote. My work is an example of this, I think, and I'm sure there are other people in the audience who can recognize a particular piece in that description as well. Importantly, and connecting the two papers, he makes the argument that we tend to focus on racial ontologies when our studies are centering power and classification and social closure, and we tend to turn to ethnic ontologies when we're focusing on identity, culture, and assimilation. So we're using these two ways of thinking about the world in different kinds of contexts. And the second paper that we're going to talk about makes this exact argument, that while the term ethnicity is privileged in New Zealand contexts, that when discussing power and white supremacy, race is the term that is most often used, and so then proceeds to use racial language in the rest of the paper in order to make that point that they're centering power and white supremacy. So I think that's an important piece of overlap between these two projects. So he develops this revised model of ethno-racialization and talks about the racialized meanings that we're assigning to populations based on a set of physical and non-physical characteristics. And I'm just going to repeat these since he had to go through them quickly, and they may not have had time to sink in. So he's proposing skin color, hair texture, bone structure, language, religion, and political geography as the set of characteristics that we use to assign these meanings. Using the US case of Black immigrants and African Americans descended from slaves, he's making this argument that they are conceptualized differently and that therefore they have different experiences in the US. Okay, so I have a couple questions that came to me as I was reading this and that I would be interested to hear the author wrestle with if he has time now, or just to think about later if we don't have time, because there are great questions in the chat. And I want to make sure we have time for those. One thing that I kept thinking as I was reading this paper is that international communities conceptualize ethnicity and race differently, and that seems like a really fruitful avenue of exploration for this particular paper. Not all contexts think of ethnicity as divorced from power, for example, and only focus on identity, culture, and assimilation type arguments when talking about ethnicity. I know you're well versed in these diverse contexts, and I think bringing that discussion in more into this discussion of the US example of the experiences of African Americans descended from slaves and Black immigrants could increase the leverage that you can bring to this problem and actually strengthen the case that you're making if that's something that you can show is not just limited to this one case, and to predominantly US based ways of thinking about what is different between race and ethnicity, and how those two conceptual terms are often used in US-based literature and US scholars. Secondly, and I think this is probably something that is coming, but just doesn't appear in this draft yet because like you said, this is something that you're working on right now. I wonder if you could make more clear what the implications of this ontology are for measurement. Not just because the title of this session has measurement in it, right? Which of course measurement is my favorite thing, so that is where my head is going to go. But I also think it will really help clarify what is useful about thinking about things in this way as opposed to conceptualizing them as two separate concepts. So, for example, the next paper does try to wrestle with this ontology, as I mentioned. What recommendations would you give an author who is collecting data and is trying to use this way of conceptualizing what ethno-racism and what ethno-racial categories mean, or somebody who's working with existing data and is trying to conceptualize what it means? The implications are not spelled out yet, for example, for what this would mean for OMB guidance on measuring racial and ethnic data. But I know that you'll get a chance to talk about that. That's coming up in the Q&A. But some basic implications seem really clear, right? So, one basic implication of what you're saying is to stop separating ethnicity and race into two separate questions and concepts when collecting data. But I'm guessing there are other less obvious implications that aren't spelled out yet. Okay, and then to move to the second paper. So this very thoughtful paper looks at the intersectionality across 8 different race, gender, class locations, and emphasizes identifying communities that are high potential for policy interventions and for policies to have an impact on the community as opposed to emphasizing deficits. It comes from this growing quant-crit perspective, using quantitative data to analyze problems with a critical race theory lens. And we saw in the presentation already the ways in which the findings point to particular communities within that race, gender, class, social location that are fruitful places for us to be thinking about policy interventions. One point I just had to add as I was listening to the introduction today is that Mita Anand mentioned that when we think about racial data, one important aspect of thinking about those data are the stories that we tell about the data, not the stories just that we tell not just how we create the data, but then the stories we tell with it. And this paper, far more than most papers, takes that question really seriously, wrestling with the question of what is the story we're telling as a primary concern of the paper. Very explicitly wrestling with the responsibility to carefully tell a story and think about the ways that that story can be used to reduce rather than exacerbate racial inequality. As I already mentioned in talking about the last paper, they mentioned in the paper as well that ethnicity is the more common framework in New Zealand, and that they're using race instead as the lens for approaching this paper because of their attention to power and white supremacy. I want to raise 3 questions that I thought were really interesting as I read this piece, and that I also think the audience for this conference would find useful for thinking about how to tackle these same types of questions in their own work. So again, my first question is a measurement question because, you know, I can't help myself. And that is when we're looking at these categories, one of the things that the authors mention that they do is prioritization, where everybody who chooses more than one ethnic category is recoded into a single ethnic or racial group. And so there's a priority. If you listed Maori and any other racial groups, you ended up being classified as Maori. If you didn't list Maori, but you listed Pacific peoples and then you ended up in Pacific peoples, and so on down a prioritization scale. So one of the questions that I had as I was reading it is, what is the impact of a measurement choice like this? I don't know this social context as well, so I don't really have a sense of how many people are choosing multiple categories in this question and how the results might change if you make different choices about how you're classifying people who identify with more than one category. So is this something that is very common and you're moving a lot of people out of multiple categories into one, or is this a relatively rare choice in these data? Secondly, the authors also talk in the paper very forthrightly about the fact that they lose a lot of cases because of missing socioeconomic status data. And I think all of us who work with data can empathize that when we want to use family income data, one of the trickiest parts is the fact that so many people have missing family income data. But I think for this particular study, there's 2 reasons that that's really interesting. One is the question of if there is bias in who is missing in income data and whether that might inform the findings. So looking at if there is the kinds of bias that we would expect in the US, for example, for example, higher socioeconomic status, people being more likely to be missing on family income. And there were other indicators of SES, so I was wondering if it's possible to create some tests to recapture some of those individuals using different measures or using a composite measure in order to also look at the question of whether recapturing some of those missing cases changes anything in your results, especially since some of the intersectional categories become quite small. So for example, there's only 27 Pacific peoples men with low SES. So if you can recapture some of those missing folks, does that change anything in your results? And finally, I want to just point out an interesting policy question that came up in the discussion of the paper that I don't think came up in the presentation, but intrigued me. And that is the question of, do we equally, from a policy perspective, value numeracy and literacy? So do we think of those 2 things as parallel and therefore equally worthy of intervention, or do we think of them as different in some way that is meaningful? I have no answer to this one. This is something that I'm simply interested in and wanted to pose as an open-ended question for us all to think about. So with all of that, thank you again for the invitation to talk about these really interesting papers, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Mary, and also thank you to the presenters, Mosi and Christopher, for your presentations. I know you got a lot of people thinking and we have a lot of questions. So why don't we start with you, Mosi? So there were a couple questions. I know you answered them in chat, but I think it'd be great for everyone to kind of hear them again. So there was a question, have you done any work to compare Black Americans and Black immigrants in terms of health disparities and looking at why these differences may exist? And then relatedly, you mentioned that Black immigrants may do better than non-immigrants. Could you define what you mean by do better and explain your methodology for determining that?
Yeah, thank you everyone for the questions. I'll try to get to these as quickly as possible. I'm also available at email, etc., and so forth. What I mean by do better is that Black immigrants have better outcomes on all kinds of economic indices and health indices than African Americans. Am I interested in health research? Absolutely. I have a paper, for example, on infant health, where we're looking at within counties across the entire United States. We're parsing African Americans who were born in that area, and stayed in that area and then gave birth in that area, compared to African Americans who gave birth in that area but were born outside the state, to Black immigrants, and then cascading counties by percentage white, and showing that Black immigrants that live in whiter neighborhoods have healthier babies, but African Americans that live in whiter areas don't. And then I'm also have something similar, looking at firm level analysis. So whiter firms, in whiter firms, Black immigrants have wage growth trajectories that are on par with their white colleagues at the firm. But when firms are mostly non-white, Black immigrants actually have the worst earnings trajectories compared to whites and African Americans. And then, I'm sorry, with health, I also have a study now showing that while African Americans with darker skin color have higher rates of cardiometabolic disease, Black immigrants with darker skin colors don't. And this theory is kind of what kind of sets it up. I just want to return back to Mary's comment. Hi, Mary. Good to see you. Love you. Great questions. Would love to sidebar with you on this stuff. So in terms of these kind of local definitions, I think given the kind of current state of global human migration, most societies can be characterized as either settler or colonial in one form or another. And so I think in these societies, you will have some language that approximates something like a race or ethnicity. You know, for the internationalists, so I like your point about talking about the localities of these definitions. You know, some of the internationalists have said, you know, if you go to a particular place, they don't use the term race, they use the term ethnicity. So we got to respect that. We can't use these colonial Americanist definitions. I mean, I don't agree with that, only because ethnicity is an English word. And so when we go into places where English is not the primary language, ethnicity has also been offered to these people. I could say more, but I think that in all cases, the reason why we move between concepts is because of these legacies of migration. In terms of implications for measurement, Mary, this is where I would love to talk to you, because I know your work and I love it. And so I want to say that I haven't thought about it. I really haven't. In ontology, and we could talk more about this, you know, Immanuel Kant starts this up in the late 18th century, but basically parses the metaphysical where ontology stands from the empirical. And so therefore ontologies are actually unable to be empirically validated. This is why sociologists have moved away from ontologies and worked only on theories where their concepts, not ontologies per se, but their concepts can be operationalized, measured, and empirically verified. And so what this means is that I can set out an ontology that might have empirical implications. We could think about that, but it doesn't direct that per se. I can say more in a sidebar, Mary. But if I had to throw something out there, get ready to be shocked, y'all. I would say the United States Census should stop measuring race and ethnicity, and instead collect information on skin color, hair texture, bone structure, language, religion, and nationality. And from that, we could use something like potentially like maybe a fuzzy set model, like Chris Bale did in his 2008 ASR paper, to compose ethno-racial groups. And I'll stop there for now.
Thanks. And actually, while we're on the topic of measurement, Christopher, I just kind of want to maybe ask what Mary was asking, talking about the impact of reclassifying people who identify with multiple ethnicities into one ethnicity. Do you have any sense of how common that is, how that might impact the data? What more can you say about that?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a lot of concerns that I have and others have around this prioritization process that happens in the New Zealand context. I don't have a number for you, but I know that it is fairly common for individuals to mark, several ethnicities in New Zealand. And the prioritization process was essentially something that was done by, official government agencies just to allow sort of a cleaner categorization. But by doing so, you really are missing a lot of information. And certainly there's, we talk about the uniqueness of the lived experience in terms of literacy and numeracy, and certainly the experience of someone that would be ticking multiple boxes versus a person that's ticking one, or a person that feels ambivalent about maybe choosing one box versus the other, versus someone who has a clear notion of which box would be most appropriate for them. These are going to result in different lived experiences. So it can be a bit frustrating as a researcher to have to sort of put people in boxes like that. It is a weakness in the approach, but I at this point I don't have a solution. One might consider a statistical model which would be many times more complex, something that would be perhaps even harder to digest. So I think we're really walking a fine line between being able to clearly interpret and communicate results, and also being able to really capture the unique experience of individuals. So it's something that I don't have a final answer on, unfortunately.
Yeah, thanks for that. And there was a question in the chat for you about the comparison group, right? Being the white non-Indigenous, and with data sovereignty being such a big issue recently, has there been any resistance that you've experienced in your work to using this as a reference group? And have you thought about including additional comparison groups to this work?
That is an excellent question. And I share those concerns. My response to that is that, I laid it out in our table number 2, where we're looking at sort of these group means. What we're doing essentially is comparing these group means to see where different groups are at in the distribution of literacy and numeracy skill proficiency. And so we want to make the results as easy to interpret as possible. And so the best, well, not the best, one way to make these results as easy to interpret as possible is to either choose a group that is at one end of the distribution or the other. For example, if we choose the group that has the highest outcome, then all of the comparison groups are going to be negative in sign. And so because they're of the same sign, we can visually look at the coefficients and sort of get an idea of how the groups compare. Now, if we take a group that's sort of in the middle of the distribution, we make that the reference group, then we're going to have some groups with the positive coefficients, some group with the negative coefficients. How far are they from zero? So it becomes more difficult to interpret sort of how the distribution stands. On the other side of that, you could choose a group on the other end of the distribution. So all of the comparisons are going to be positive in sign. So whether you grab the group that has the highest outcome or grab the group that has the lowest outcome as the reference group, I think those are probably the two clearest choices in terms of presenting the results in the most digestible way, in the clearest possible way.
Great, thank you. And then let's turn to Mosey. I know you have something to say about modeling, and we have just a couple of minutes left, about 2 to 3 minutes left. And then Mosey, I also to just mention your paper on the model minority perception, because I know there are a lot of questions about that. So I want to make sure everyone is aware of that in case they didn't see that you posted that link.
Yeah. I drew on some historical work and my own work. and use an empirical test, but I did develop something that we might call that Afro-Caribbean model minority myth in a 2016 paper. I think it is in the Du Bois Review, but you can find it pretty easy with my name. Also, there were some people who kind of thought that maybe I was African or something given my name. I'm African American, descendant of American slavery. My parents were Black nationalists, so I have an African name, and I was initiated to a traditional African priesthood at the age of 17, which changed my last name. I did have some questions, a thought about this modeling technique. For a number of years, I taught a class, Race, Ethnicity, and Quantitative Epistemologies at the University of Michigan, ICPSR Summer Stats Camp. And I have some thoughts about limitations with this kind of, if you will, kind of interactional framework to conceive of intersectional processes. And so in short, the way the regression model will work is that the largest group, which is often the omitted group because it's often considered to be the dominant group, is driving means across all of the covariates. So whether or not it's the omitted group or not, if you have 75 white people and 25 Black people, and white people have a mean of 200 and Black people have a mean of 50, given the size of those groups, that mean that's underlying the coefficient is going to be biased towards white. So in effect, you're going to be assigning, sort of thinking about Black people who have the values that white people have, even if very few, if any, have those values. And then if whites are the omitted group, or the dominant group is the omitted group, that falls into the intercept, which sort of biases all of the loadings, if you will, or all of the weights as a result. And so I think we have some thinking to do in terms of modeling. An argument that I offer in a paper that's underway is that we just have separate equations for various reasons. It avoids some of these issues. And I'll happy to say more, but I want to be respectful of time.
Thank you. And that brings us to time for our session. So I really want to thank Mosey, Christopher, and Mary for your contributions today. It was definitely a very insightful session, and it sparked a lot of conversation in the chat. So thank you so much for your contributions today. Nicholas, did you want to say anything before we break?
And to all of our panelists, hope everyone has a nice lunch break, and we'll see you back later this afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, everyone. So it looks like we're going to break here. So appreciate everybody for coming and joining. We're probably going to close out this session today. That was very interesting. The brother Mossy at the end saying that I believe he sounds like he's a Black American descendant. So that was very interesting. So I don't know if anyone is in the chat or not. But if you do want to continue, have us recording this, press 1. If not, we're just going to close out here. They're actually going to break and they're going to come back, but we will be covering tomorrow as well. So if I don't see anyone's in the chat in the next 5 seconds, we're just going to conclude for today, and then we'll cover tomorrow. All right. So it doesn't look like I'm seeing anything in the chat. So we're going to close out, but we will be back tomorrow. I'm going to put up the cover here. So they're going to have a day 2, a U.S. Census Bureau workshop on advancing research on race, ethnicity, and inequality. It's going to be day 2 of 2 tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern, 6 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. So I appreciate everyone for watching and joining. They should have it available for the full, I believe, coverage of the U.S. Bureau of today's workshop. So once they do have the full coverage, we'll go ahead and put it in the description and link that to this video if anyone is interested in watching the full coverage. But we just wanted to make sure, at least for the people that watch our platform, that we, covered at least a little bit of it, so we kind of understand what the U.S. Census Bureau, where they're headed and where they're going. I think we did get some data and information from them that the U.S. Census Bureau did release. So we're going to actually go through that data to see if we can try to pull some information, especially, on the Black American experience, in particular with Black firms that do have employment. And we're also going to see, hopefully we can try to get somebody from the U.S. Census Bureau on the platform. So we can talk specifically about Black American descendants, aka freedmen, FBA, ADOS, DOS, however you term yourself in terms of lineage-based information and reparations. So on that note, family, I guess they're going to go to lunch. If you are interested in continuing and participating in this U.S. Bureau workshop, just go on to the U.S. Bureau website, and it's like a WebEx type of thing. So you have to log on to WebEx, but it does take a minute to get it up. But hey, you can continue on with it. But we're actually going to stop here on this live stream, and we will be back tomorrow at 9 a.m. Eastern Standard, which is 6 a.m. Pacific Standard. So once again, thank you for joining, and we will see you tomorrow right here on Amen the Mass Media Group. Everyone take care, and as always, peace and reparations.
The way it currently stands, forced labor, slavery takes precedence over rehabilitation and public safety.
Oh, by the way, while the Biden administration gives reparations to everyone but freed people, look at the billions he has run over to Ukraine.
We don't have Black grocery stores because if you think about it now, just to get in that supply chain, it's almost unheard of.
They don't want the truth to get out. Okay? I don't want to know what my family did or what all these people did and all this stuff like that. Okay? You read that 500-page report.
There's this thing called white superiority and black inferiority. That mindset allows all of the behaviors that we've seen across generations.
They had no idea that that church I was running by every day was something my grandfather established.
This is not a handout. This is a debt that is owed.
Allensworth was like the internet of his time in 1904, 1905.
The total Black population in California is about 2.6 million. And then of that, the descendants compose about 2.2 million of that. So California, with a multi-billion-dollar surplus, can absolutely afford to satisfy the international terms for reparations, beginning with compensation.
Any financial obstacle that exists that impedes the success of increasing financial prosperity needs to be dealt with and eliminated.
No matter where we've been, no matter what part of this fight we've been in, we've been harmed, and we've had harm done to us specifically.
When I got to Los Angeles, this was some of the worst segregation I'd ever seen. And remember, I'm telling you, I'm from Mississippi.
Because as you can see, I'm giving you broken history right now, but I had to give it to you guys today. I said, no, I got to show them this because it's so precious and nobody really knows about it.
Overnight, it's like, oh, it's no longer the quarters, now it's Lincoln Heights. Oh, so now we get to use Abraham Lincoln for our name. And you think about all the other people that they could have used, but they picked Lincoln. And I think that's sort of a stereotypical of what they do.
There wasn't any Black restaurants. As far as Black business and weed, it wasn't none.
Black people don't have that kind of luxury. Our historically Black communities have been redistricted multiple times.
Why has it been easier for other groups than us?
Because of anti-Black hatred.
Now listen, if you can't handle the TR room, don't tune in.